Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. I don't remember the exact moment when I first touched the clock. It had always been in the attic, collecting dust, hidden behind boxes filled with forgotten things. I didn't even know it belonged to me until the day my uncle passed away, and I was left with the remnants of his life. The clock, an antique with no hands, was one of the few objects he left behind. I had never paid much attention to it. It wasn't particularly beautiful or remarkable. Its wooden frame was dark and worn, and the face was cracked in several places. The absence of hands made it seem like something was missing, but it didn't seem to matter. I thought it was broken, and so I left it there, in the corner of the room, with the rest of the forgotten items. But one night, as I was cleaning the attic, I decided to take a closer look. The air was thick with dust, the kind of stillness that only a place untouched for years could have. I wiped the dust from its surface, my fingers brushing against the cracked glass. The moment I touched it, something happened. A ripple of warmth spread through my hand, and for a brief moment, I saw something that didn't belong to this world. A shadow, fleeting and indistinct, passed in front of me. I blinked, and it was gone. I looked around the room, trying to make sense of what I had just experienced, but there was nothing. The silence returned, suffocating and heavy. I shrugged it off, telling myself that it was just a trick of the mind, a result of too many hours spent in the dark, dusty attic. But the next time I touched the clock, it happened again. This time, I saw more, a face, blurry and indistinct, standing in a place I didn't recognize. The figure seemed to be reaching out to me, but before I could make sense of it, the vision vanished. I jerked my hand back, heart racing, but the clock remained still, its empty face staring back at me. There was no ticking, no sound of time passing. Just the strange feeling that something had been seen, something I wasn't supposed to know. What was this clock? Why was I seeing glimpses of something that didn't make sense? It wasn't just a broken timepiece, it was something more, something I couldn't explain. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the answers were just out of reach. I had to know more. I had to understand. But I didn't realize then how much my life was about to change. I didn't know that the clock, this strange, silent thing, would become the lens through which I would see things I was never meant to witness. And once I started, there would be no turning back. For now, though, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something was wrong. I had barely started to explore the clock's mystery, but I could already sense the danger it brought with it. Something was watching. Something was waiting. And it was getting closer. The next few days felt different. The air seemed thicker, almost heavier, as though the world itself was holding its breath. It was subtle at first, just a feeling that clung to me like a second skin, but it soon became impossible to ignore. There were moments when I could swear I saw something out of the corner of my eye, shadows moving in places where they shouldn't be, whispers that I couldn't quite make out. At night, the silence was unbearable, pressing on me, filling the room with a sense of dread I couldn't explain. I couldn't bring myself to touch the clock again, not after what had happened. But I knew I had to. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was something deeper, a compulsion I couldn't shake. The more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the pull became. So, one evening, after hours of pacing, I gave in. I went back to the attic. The clock stood there, unchanged, its cracked face staring back at me. I could feel my pulse quicken as I approached it. My fingers hovered above it for a moment before I touched the glass once more. This time, the vision came faster. There was no delay, no warning. It was as if the moment my skin made contact with the glass, the world around me dissolved into fragments of images, sharp and vivid. I saw a dark alley, narrow, with broken windows and a flickering streetlight at the far end. I could hear the distant sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing off the walls. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I wanted to look away, to pull my hand back from the clock, but I couldn't move. My eyes were locked onto the scene, my body frozen in place. And then, I saw it. A figure in the shadows, just out of reach of the dim light. It was tall, hunched over, its face obscured by a hood. The figure moved slowly, almost gliding through the alley, as if it didn't belong there. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was staring at me. I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. My heart raced. I didn't know what I was seeing, but I knew it was real. This wasn't just some hallucination. This wasn't just my imagination running wild. Whatever this was, it was happening. And it was happening to me. I pulled my hand away, gasping for air, but the vision didn't end. It lingered in the corners of my mind, like a shadow that refused to leave. The alley, the figure, the sense of dread, they all stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I looked at the clock, now silent again, its empty face mocking me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me, that it had more to show. But I was afraid. Afraid of what else it could reveal, afraid of what I might see next. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure again, walking through the alley, its eyes locked onto mine. I couldn't escape it. No matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was just a dream, I knew deep down that it was something more. The clock had shown me something I wasn't supposed to see, and I had no idea what it meant or why it had chosen me. But I knew one thing for certain, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The clock had opened a door, and there was no going back. The next morning, I woke with a heavy feeling in my chest. Sleep had been elusive, and when I finally drifted off, the dreams that came were worse than being awake. The alley, the figure, the sound of those footsteps, it all replayed in my mind over and over, like a broken record I couldn't turn off. I avoided the attic that day. I couldn't bring myself to look at the clock, let alone touch it. But the visions lingered, haunting the edges of my thoughts. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound sharper. Even in the daylight, I felt as though I was being watched. By evening, the weight of it all became too much to bear. I needed answers. If the clock was going to keep invading my mind, then I had to face it. Ignoring it wouldn't make it stop. When I returned to the attic, the room felt different. The air was colder, the silence heavier. The clock stood where I had left it, but now it seemed more alive, as if it was waiting for me. My hands trembled as I reached out to touch it again. This time, the vision was immediate. I found myself standing in a room I didn't recognize. The walls were bare, the floor covered in a thin layer of dust. A single window let in a sliver of moonlight, casting long shadows across the space. In the center of the room was a table, and on it, something familiar. The clock. But this version of the clock was different. It wasn't cracked or dusty. It gleamed, its wooden frame polished to perfection. And its face wasn't empty anymore. Two black hands pointed to 12, frozen in place. I stepped closer, unable to resist. The air around the clock felt electric, humming with energy. As I reached out to touch it, a voice broke the silence. "Don't." I froze. The voice was low and rough, coming from the shadows in the corner of the room. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was there, the same one from the alley. It stepped into the moonlight, and for the first time, I saw its face, or rather, the absence of one. Its features were blurred, like smudges on a wet painting. Eyes, nose, mouth, they were all there, but they didn't seem real. "You shouldn't have touched it," the figure said. Its voice seemed to echo, as though coming from somewhere far away. "What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What's happening to me?" The figure tilted its head, as if considering my question. "You've seen too much. The clock is not for you." "But it's mine," I said. "It was left to me. Why is it showing me these things?" The figure took a step closer, its movements slow and deliberate. "The clock doesn't belong to anyone. It's a doorway, not a possession. And now that you've opened it, you must choose." "Choose?" I repeated. "Choose what?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached out, its hand impossibly long and thin. For a moment, I thought it was going to touch me, but instead, it pointed to the clock on the table. "You have until the hands move," it said. "After that, it will decide for you." Before I could respond, the vision ended. I was back in the attic, the cracked clock in front of me. My breathing was ragged, my heart pounding like a drum. The hands. I looked at the clock again, and my blood ran cold. The once empty face now had hands, thin, black, and motionless, both pointing to 12. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. The clock had given me a choice, but I didn't know what it meant. And I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. I couldn't stop staring at the clock. The hands were still, as though frozen in time, yet their presence changed everything. A deep, gnawing fear took root in my chest. The figure's words echoed in my mind, "You have until the hands move." What did that mean? What would happen when they moved? I spent hours trying to make sense of it. The attic felt suffocating, the air growing colder with every passing minute. I searched for answers in the clock's surface, but it remained silent, an unyielding mystery. By midnight, exhaustion and fear had driven me to a breaking point. I took the clock downstairs, placing it on the kitchen table where I could watch it closely. The dim light from the overhead bulb cast harsh shadows on its face, making the black hands look sharper, more menacing. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, waiting, watching. Every tick of the wall clock on the other side of the room felt louder, more ominous. But the hands on the antique clock remained still. Until they didn't. It was subtle at first, just a slight tremor in the minute hand. I blinked, thinking I had imagined it, but then it happened again. The hand moved, not with a smooth, measured motion like a regular clock, but with a jarring, unnatural jerk. 1 minute forward. My breath caught in my throat. I felt a strange pull, as if the room itself shifted. The air grew heavy, and the shadows seemed to stretch, reaching toward me. I wanted to run, to get as far away from the clock as possible, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen, paralyzed by the invisible force that had taken hold of the room. The minute hand jerked forward again. This time, the pull was stronger. The world around me wavered, like ripples on the surface of water. And then I was no longer in my kitchen. I was back in the room from the vision. The same table, the same dust-covered floor. The clock stood in the center, its hands now moving steadily. The minute hand inched forward, ticking closer to the next hour. And I wasn't alone. The figure was there, standing in the corner, watching me. Its blurred face was unnervingly still, but I could feel its gaze, sharp and unrelenting. "You're running out of time," it said, its voice like a distant echo. "What does it mean?" I asked, my voice cracking. "What happens when the hands reach 12? The figure stepped closer. The air around it shimmered, distorting the space like heat waves on asphalt. "The clock is a door," it said. "Each movement of the hands opens it wider. And when it strikes 12, the figure didn't finish. It didn't have to." I could feel the weight of its words, the unspoken promise of something terrible waiting just beyond the threshold. "How do I stop it?" I demanded. "You can't," it said. "Not anymore. You've already touched it, already seen too much. The only way out is through." The hands moved again, faster this time. The minute hand jerked forward, and the hour hand twitched slightly, closing the distance to 12. The pull grew stronger, and I felt myself being dragged toward the clock. I turned to the figure, desperation taking over. "What happens if I go through?" The figure tilted its head. "You'll find the truth. But truth has a price." Before I could ask what that price was, the clock struck 11. The sound was deafening, a deep, resonant chime that shook the walls and rattled my bones. The pull became unbearable. The world around me fractured, splitting into shards of light and shadow. I was being drawn toward the clock, toward the door it was opening. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. The pull from the clock became overwhelming. My body felt weightless, as though I were being unraveled thread by thread, drawn toward the gleaming hands now relentlessly ticking closer to 12. The world around me dissolved into fragments, familiar objects from my home flickering like a dying light bulb, merging with scenes I didn't recognize. And then, silence. I found myself in a place that defied logic. The space around me was vast, infinite, and impossibly dark. Yet there was light, soft, flickering, as if from countless unseen candles. Shadows danced across the expanse, creating shapes and figures that disappeared the moment I tried to focus on them. The clock was there, suspended in the void, its hands now racing forward. Each movement echoed like a heartbeat, growing louder, faster. The figure was there too, standing beside the clock. But now, it was clearer, more defined. Its blurred features began to solidify, taking on a face that was disturbingly familiar. It was mine. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. "What is this? What's happening?" The figure, my figure, smiled, a cold, lifeless expression. "This is the end of the door. And the beginning of the truth." "What truth?" I demanded. "You already know," it said. "The visions you've seen, the shadows, the footsteps, they weren't warnings. They were reflections. Pieces of yourself, scattered and hidden. The clock doesn't show the future. It shows you." I shook my head, the words not making sense. "No, that's not possible. I saw places I've never been, things I couldn't know." "You've been here before," it said, stepping closer. Its voice was calm, almost soothing. This place, this darkness, it's where everything begins and ends. The clock was never about time, it was about you finding your way back. Back to what? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped aside, revealing a doorway where the clock had been. It was a simple wooden door, its surface smooth and unmarked. Yet, it radiated an energy I could feel in my bones, a mixture of dread and inevitability. The choice is yours, the figure said. Step through, and you'll understand everything. Stay, and the clock will rewind. You return to where you began, but you'll carry the weight of what you've seen. The shadows will follow you. The clock will wait. I stared at the door, my mind racing. Step through? Return? Neither option felt safe. Neither felt real. What happens if I go back? I asked. The figure's smile faded. The visions will never stop. The hands will begin their journey again. And next time, you might not have the chance to choose. The clock chimed again, its sound deeper and more resonant than before. The door began to creak open, revealing nothing but blinding white light. My legs felt heavy, as though the weight of the decision was dragging me down. But I knew I couldn't stay here. And I couldn't go back. I stepped forward, my hand trembling as I reached for the door. The moment my fingers touched the handle, a flood of memories, not visions, but memories, washed over me. Faces, places, and moments I had forgotten or never known filled my mind, overwhelming and all-encompassing. And then, I stepped through. I awoke in my bed, gasping for air. The room was silent, still. The clock was gone. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream. But when I glanced at the wall, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A single black hand, embedded in the plaster, pointing directly at me. The clock might have been gone, but I knew its door had never truly closed. Have you ever looked out your window and felt like someone was looking back, not just at you, but through you? It started on Tuesday night. The city was quiet, muffled by the heavy snow falling outside. I was sitting by my window, a cup of lukewarm tea in hand, staring at the building across the street. The apartment across from mine had always been empty. Its windows were dark, its curtains drawn, a forgotten corner of the block. But that night, light spilled out onto the snow-covered street, casting long, eerie shadows. I noticed the family inside before I even realized I was staring. A man, a woman, and a little boy. They were seated around a table, eating dinner, their movements slow and deliberate. Something about them felt odd. It took me a moment to understand why. They were moving exactly like my family had that evening. I live alone, but every Tuesday, my brother Alex and his son Ethan visit. That night, we had spaghetti for dinner. I remembered Ethan dropping his fork, Alex laughing, and me standing to fetch a napkin. Across the street, the woman stood and handed the man a napkin. The boy giggled, his tiny hand brushing his father's arm. It was the same scene, almost frame for frame, except it was happening minutes after I had lived it. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Maybe I was tired, imagining things. But the longer I watched, the more the synchronicities piled up. After dinner, I moved to the couch, Alex flipped through channels on the TV, and Ethan played with a toy truck. Across the street, the man and woman mirrored our movements. The boy even held a toy truck in his hands. I leaned closer to the glass, my breath fogging the window. Who were these people? How had they mimicked my evenings so perfectly? Then, something changed. As I stared, the woman in the other apartment froze mid-movement. She was holding a glass of water, her hand halfway to her lips. The man looked up, confused. The boy stopped playing, his head snapping toward the window, toward me. The boy's face was pale, his eyes wide and hollow. He raised a hand slowly and pointed at me. My heart stopped. I yanked the curtains closed, my hands trembling. I told myself it was a trick of the light, that my imagination was playing games with me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind against the windows, felt like a warning. I kept picturing the boy's face, his unblinking stare, the way he pointed directly at me. When morning came, I gathered the courage to look out the window again. The apartment across the street was dark. The curtains were drawn, the windows lifeless. For a brief moment, I felt relief. Maybe it had all been in my head. Maybe I dreamt the whole thing. But when I went to the kitchen to make coffee, something on my table caught my eye. A small toy truck, identical to the one Ethan had been playing with. And I hadn't brought it there. The toy truck sat on my table like a challenge, daring me to explain its presence. I stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest. It was Ethan's truck, down to the chipped paint on the side and the missing wheel. But Ethan had left hours before, and I hadn't brought the truck inside. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It felt real, cold, and solid. My mind raced through possibilities. Had Alex left it by mistake? No, that didn't make sense. I'd cleaned the table after they left. The truck hadn't been there. My phone buzzed on the counter, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was Alex. "Hey," I said, trying to sound normal. "Did Ethan leave his truck here last night?" Alex's voice was puzzled. "No, he had it with him when we left." "Why?" I swallowed hard, glancing back at the truck. "No reason. Just thought I saw it." We ended the call, but his confusion lingered in my mind. If Ethan hadn't left the truck, where had it come from? I decided to test my sanity. I went to the window and pulled the curtains back. The apartment across the street was dark, just as it had been that morning. No lights, no movement. It looked abandoned again, as if the family I'd seen had never existed. But I knew what I'd seen. That evening, as darkness fell, the lights in the apartment flickered again. My stomach twisted. I didn't want to look, but my curiosity got the better of me. I turned off my own lights and stood at the window, hidden in the shadows. The same family was there. The man, the woman, the boy. They were sitting on the couch this time, watching TV. The boy held the toy truck in his hands, rolling it back and forth on his lap. I felt a chill run down my spine. Their movements were slower now, less natural. The man leaned toward the woman, whispering something in her ear. She nodded, her eyes darting toward the window. My window. I stepped back, my heart hammering. When I looked again, the boy was standing. He walked to the window, his small figure silhouetted by the light behind him. He stared out at the street for a long moment, then turned his head sharply to face me. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. His eyes locked with mine, even through the dark glass. I closed the curtains again, my hands shaking. But the fear didn't stop there. I started noticing other things. Small, insignificant details that shouldn't have mattered but felt wrong. My reflection in the bathroom mirror lingered for a second too long. Shadows in the hallway shifted when I wasn't looking. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly through my apartment late at night, even though I lived alone. And then there were the visions. At first, I thought they were just dreams. Flashes of scenes that felt too vivid to be imagined. I saw myself sitting at the window, staring out at the other apartment. But in the vision, the family across the street wasn't mimicking me anymore. They were ahead of me. In the vision, the man got up and walked toward the front door. A moment later, there was a knock on mine. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. My apartment was silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. When I checked the window the next day, the curtains across the street were closed again. But I knew it wasn't over. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening in that apartment wasn't just mirroring my life. It was pulling me towards something, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know what. The unease didn't leave me. Each passing day brought more questions, more cracks in the thin veneer of normalcy I'd built for myself. The apartment across the street became a fixation, an ever-present weight pressing down on my thoughts. By the third night, I couldn't help myself. When the lights flickered on in the apartment opposite mine, I pulled the curtains back just enough to see. The family was there again, but something had changed. They were no longer seated together. The man stood near the window, his face partially obscured by the shadow of the frame. The woman sat on the couch, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The boy was gone. My stomach dropped. I scanned the room, looking for him. He was always there, always watching. Then, as if sensing my thoughts, the man turned his head toward me. I froze. The way his head moved, it wasn't natural. It was too deliberate, like the slow turning of a rusty gear. His eyes locked onto mine, piercing through the dark glass. And then he smiled. I stumbled backward, pulling the curtain shut. My chest tightened as panic clawed its way up my throat. I tried to calm myself, repeating over and over that this wasn't real, that it couldn't be real. That's when I heard it. A knock at the door. It was soft, almost polite, but it echoed through the silent apartment like a gunshot. I stared at the door, my breath caught in my lungs. Another knock followed, louder this time, more insistent. I didn't move. The knocking stopped, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. I tiptoed to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. "Who's there?" I managed to whisper. No answer. I waited a long time, listening for any sound, any sign of movement. Finally, I mustered the courage to look through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I exhaled shakily, but relief didn't come. Something didn't feel right. The air in the apartment was heavier now, the silence deeper, almost tangible. I turned back toward the living room, and that's when I saw it. The toy truck was back on the table. Only this time, it wasn't alone. Next to it was a piece of paper, folded neatly in half. I hadn't heard anyone enter. I hadn't seen anyone leave. With trembling hands, I picked up the note and unfolded it. 3 words were scrawled across the page in jagged, uneven handwriting. "We are waiting." My vision blurred as panic took hold. I dropped the note and stepped back, nearly tripping over the chair behind me. I grabbed my phone and dialed Alex. The line rang and rang, but he didn't pick up. "Come on, Alex," I muttered, pacing the room. I called again, my hands slick with sweat. This time, he answered. "Hello? Alex. Thank God. Something's wrong. I need you to come over." "Slow down," he said, his voice calm but distant. "What's going on?" I opened my mouth to explain, but the words caught in my throat. A faint sound reached my ears, static, soft but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from the other side of the apartment. I turned slowly, the phone slipping from my grasp as I saw what was happening. The television, which I hadn't turned on in days, flickered to life. But there was no program, no signal, just static, crackling and shifting. And through the static, I saw them. The man, the woman, and the boy. They weren't in their apartment anymore. They were in mine. The boy stood in the corner, his toy truck clutched tightly in his hands. The woman sat on the couch, her lifeless eyes fixed on me. The man stood by the window, his face hidden in shadow. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The man took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. The boy raised his hand, pointing at me once again, and the lights in my apartment went out. The darkness swallowed everything. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I fumbled for my phone, my only source of light. The static from the television had stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its place. I found my phone on the floor, its screen casting a faint glow. The call with Alex had disconnected. I tried dialing again, but my fingers trembled too much to press the buttons correctly. A soft noise broke the silence, a creak, faint but deliberate. It came from the corner where the boy had been standing. I turned the phone's flashlight toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, but the corner was empty. The toy truck, however, was there, sitting on the floor. It was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, it rolled forward, stopping just at the edge of the light. My chest tightened as I backed away, my mind racing. They were here, somewhere in the apartment. I could feel their presence, heavy and suffocating, pressing against the walls. Another sound. This time, it was a whisper, soft and fleeting, like leaves rustling in the wind. "We are waiting." The words sent a shiver down my spine. They were faint, but they echoed, repeating in a loop, growing louder and clearer. I swung the flashlight toward the living room. The couch was empty. The TV screen was dark. The window, however, was wide open. The cold night air poured in, carrying with it the faintest scent of something metallic, blood. I forced myself to move, inching toward the window. My heart pounded as I leaned out, scanning the street below. Snow blanketed the ground, untouched and pristine. No footprints. No sign of anyone. And yet, as I stared, I saw movement in the apartment across the street. The family was back. They were standing now, all three of them, lined up perfectly in front of the window. They weren't looking at me this time, they were looking at each other, their heads tilting at unnatural angles. The boy turned first, his hollow eyes locking onto mine. The woman followed, her neck twisting too far, too quickly. The man was last, his smile spreading unnaturally wide. In unison, they raised their hands and pointed. I stumbled back from the window, nearly tripping over the toy truck again. "We are waiting." The whisper came from behind me this time, louder and closer. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting wildly across the room. There, in the doorway to my bedroom, stood the boy. His small figure was silhouetted against the faint glow of my phone. He clutched the truck in one hand, his head tilted as if studying me. Before I could react, he turned and ran, disappearing into the shadows. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "No, no, no." I ran after him, my flashlight trembling in my grasp. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, the walls narrowing, the darkness deepening. My footsteps echoed strangely, each sound growing more distorted. I reached my bedroom door and froze. The man was there, standing at the foot of my bed. His back was to me, his shoulders hunched. He didn't move, didn't react. I took a step forward, my breath shallow and uneven. "Who are you?" I demanded, though my voice barely carried above a whisper. Slowly, the man turned. His face wasn't human. It was a twisted reflection of my own, distorted and wrong, like a photograph stretched and warped beyond recognition. His eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and his mouth opened, emitting a low, guttural sound. Behind him, the woman appeared, her lifeless gaze fixed on me. She held the boy's hand, and together they stepped closer. I backed away, my flashlight flickering. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with their presence. I tripped, falling hard onto the floor. The flashlight skittered away, its beam casting erratic shadows across the room. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and echoing. "We are waiting. We are waiting." The family loomed over me, their faces grotesque and unrecognizable. And then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was alone. The apartment was silent. The lights were on, the air still. I sat up slowly, my head pounding. The toy truck was gone. The note was gone. But the whispers, they stayed, faint and persistent, always at the edge of my hearing. I wasn't sure if they were real or if I was losing my mind. But one thing was certain. Whatever was waiting for me wasn't finished. Days passed, but the events of that night refused to leave me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, twisted, unnatural, and always watching. The whispers never stopped, faint but insistent, like a song stuck on repeat. I tried to resume my life, but normalcy was an illusion. The world felt warped, as though I were living in a fragile reflection of reality, one crack away from shattering. The apartment across the street remained dark. I hadn't seen the family since that night, but their absence didn't bring comfort. It brought a deeper kind of dread, the fear of the unknown. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of red and gold, I sat by the window, staring at the empty apartment. My thoughts spiraled, replaying every detail, every moment. And then I saw it. A flicker of movement. The lights in the apartment flickered on, one by one, casting a warm glow over the familiar scene. They were back. The family stood by the window, their poses eerily familiar. The man had his hands in his pockets, the woman cradled a mug, and the boy held his toy truck. They stood motionless, like actors awaiting their cue. I wanted to look away, to close the curtains and pretend I hadn't seen them. But I couldn't. The boy moved first, stepping closer to the window. His small hand raised slowly, deliberately, until he was pointing directly at me. The woman followed, her head tilting to the side in that unnatural way. The man was last, his grin stretching impossibly wide. My phone buzzed on the table, breaking the trance. I snatched it up, my hands trembling. The screen displayed an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Hello?" I whispered. A distorted voice crackled through the speaker, barely comprehensible. We are waiting. The call disconnected, leaving only the faint hum of static. I dropped the phone and backed away from the window, my pulse pounding in my ears. The whispers grew louder, no longer confined to the edge of my hearing. They were everywhere now, surrounding me, filling the room. I ran to the door, yanking it open. The hallway was empty, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. But as I stepped out, I froze. The walls were lined with mirrors. They stretched endlessly in both directions, reflecting me over and over, a distorted infinite loop. I turned to look back at my apartment, but the door was gone. Panic clawed at my chest as I stumbled forward, each step echoing endlessly. The whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. In the mirrors, my reflection began to change. It wasn't me anymore. The man from the apartment stared back at me, his twisted grin stretching wider with every step I took. The boy and the woman stood behind him, their lifeless eyes fixed on mine. I broke into a run, the mirrors blurring as I moved. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, and the reflections distorted further, the faces shifting and contorting. And then, suddenly, I was back. I stood in my living room, the silence deafening. The whispers were gone, the air still. The window was closed, the curtains drawn. I sank to the floor, my body trembling. Had it all been a hallucination? A nightmare? My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message. I hesitated before opening it. 3 words stared back at me, sending a chill through my entire being. Look behind you. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned. The family was there, standing in the shadows of my apartment. The boy stepped forward, his toy truck rolling to a stop at my feet. And then, the lights went out. The apartment across the street remains dark to this day, its windows reflecting only emptiness. But every night, I hear the whispers. And every night, I wait, knowing that one day, it will be my turn to cross into their world. Have you ever received a message that changed everything? It started on an ordinary evening, just as the sky turned a dusky orange. I was sitting on my worn-out couch, sipping lukewarm coffee, when I heard the faint rustle of paper sliding under my door. Curious, I got up, walked over, and found a plain white envelope lying on the mat. No stamps, no return address, just my name scribbled in bold, uneven letters. I hesitated before picking it up. The paper felt oddly cold, like it had been sitting in a freezer. I opened it, my hands trembling slightly, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The message was brief. Tonight, the light in the stairwell will go out at 9. I frowned, my first thought being some kind of prank. I glanced at the clock. It was 8:30. Tossing the letter onto the coffee table, I dismissed it as nonsense. But at exactly 9 o'clock, as I was brushing my teeth, the hallway outside my apartment plunged into darkness. The faint hum of the fluorescent bulb ceased, leaving only silence. A chill ran down my spine. I stood frozen, staring at my own reflection in the bathroom mirror, my mind racing. It could have been a coincidence. Lights go out all the time, right? But something about the timing unsettled me. The next evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, another envelope appeared. This time, I watched from the peephole, determined to catch whoever was leaving these strange letters. No one was there. I bent down and picked up the envelope. My name was scrawled in the same jagged handwriting. The paper inside read, "The man in apartment 3B will knock on your door at 10. Don't answer." My heart skipped a beat. Apartment 3B belonged to an old man named Mr. Holloway, a quiet widower who rarely left his flat. Why would he knock on my door? As the clock ticked closer to 10, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the door. My hands were clammy, my breathing shallow. At 10 o'clock sharp, 3 deliberate knocks echoed through the apartment. Knock. 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 I jumped, my pulse pounding in my ears. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Then curiosity got the better of me. Who is it? I called, my voice trembling. No response. The knocks came again, louder this time. Knock. 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 I moved closer to the door, peering through the peephole. There was no one there. I stumbled back, my thoughts spiraling. This wasn't normal. Someone was toying with me, or worse. The next day, I didn't leave my apartment. I worked from home, keeping one eye on the door at all times. By sunset, I was a bundle of nerves, jumping at every little sound. At twilight, the third letter arrived. The storm will knock out the power at midnight. Stay inside. I glanced out the window. The sky was clear, not a single cloud in sight. The forecast had said nothing about a storm. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the letters were more than coincidences. So I stayed up, waiting. At midnight, the wind began to howl. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder rumbled in the distance. Then the power went out. I sat in the darkness, clutching the flashlight I prepared, my heart racing. What was happening? Who was sending these letters, and how did they know what was going to happen? In the silence of the powerless night, I realized one thing: whoever the sender was, they were watching me. And they knew more about my life than I was comfortable admitting. The next morning, I awoke to sunlight streaming through the curtains. Everything seemed normal, as if the previous night's events had been a bad dream. But when I glanced at the coffee table, the 3 letters stared back at me, their unsettling predictions burned into my mind. I decided to do something about it. Grabbing my phone, I called the building manager, Mr. Grayson. He was an older man, perpetually annoyed by tenant complaints, but I had to ask him about the power outage and if anyone else had noticed the strange occurrences. The storm, he repeated, sounding puzzled. What storm? Power's been fine all week. I froze. But last night, there was thunder, and the lights went out. Not here, he replied curtly. If you've got a problem with your apartment, put in a request. He hung up before I could say anything else. My stomach churned. If the storm hadn't happened to anyone else, then what had I experienced? That evening, the tension grew unbearable. I paced the apartment, checking the clock every few minutes. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I locked the door, closed the curtains, and waited. Sure enough, just as the last rays of light faded, the 4th letter slid under my door. This time, I didn't hesitate. I lunged for it, yanked it open, and unfolded the paper. Tonight, the mirror will show you something that isn't there. I dropped the letter as if it had burned me. The bathroom mirror loomed at the edge of my vision, reflecting nothing but the dim light of the apartment. My rational mind told me this was ridiculous. Mirrors don't show things that aren't there. It was just another prank, or maybe a hallucination caused by stress. But as the minutes ticked by, I couldn't ignore the growing unease. By 10 o'clock, I was standing in front of the mirror, my reflection staring back at me. My face was pale, my eyes shadowed with exhaustion. I leaned closer, studying every detail, every imperfection. For a long moment, nothing happened. And then it did. The reflection shifted, not all at once, but subtly, like ripples on the surface of water. My face blurred, and a new image began to take shape. It was me, but not me. The reflection's eyes were darker, almost black, and its lips twisted into a cruel smile. It raised a hand, and I froze as I realized my own hand wasn't moving. I stumbled back, knocking over the towel rack. The sound broke the spell, and the reflection snapped back to normal. I stared at myself, my chest heaving, the air around me feeling heavy and oppressive. I couldn't stay here. Grabbing my phone, I called my friend Andrew, the only person I trusted to believe me. "Hey, it's late," he answered groggily. "What's up?" I struggled to find the words. "Something's wrong. These letters, they keep showing up, and they're predicting things. Weird things." Andrew paused. "Are you okay? Have you been sleeping?" "I'm not imagining this," I snapped. "Can you come over? Please?" He sighed. "All right, give me half an hour." I hung up and sat on the couch, trying to calm my racing heart. The mirror incident played over and over in my mind, each detail more vivid than the last. When the knock came at the door, I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Andrew?" I called, walking cautiously toward the door. "Yeah, it's me." His voice was muffled but familiar. I unlocked the door and opened it, relief flooding through me. But it wasn't Andrew. Standing in the hallway was a man I'd never seen before. He was dressed in a mail carrier's uniform, his face shadowed by the dim hallway light. In his gloved hand, he held a single envelope. "For you," he said, his voice calm and measured. Before I could respond, he placed the envelope in my hand and walked away, disappearing around the corner. I stood there, stunned, the envelope cold in my grasp. Tearing it open, I read the message inside. "Andrew will never make it here." My breath caught. I grabbed my phone, frantically dialing Andrew's number. The call rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. Panic set in. I grabbed my coat and keys, ready to leave the apartment and find him. But as I opened the door, I froze. Another envelope lay at my feet. This one was different, thicker, as if it contained more than just a single sheet of paper. I picked it up with shaking hands, dreading what I might find inside. The note was brief. "Stay where you are. If you leave, you won't come back." The hallway outside was silent, but I swore I heard faint footsteps, growing louder with each passing second. I stood frozen in the doorway, the envelope still in my hand, my fingers numb from the coldness of it. The words on the paper seemed to echo in my mind, reverberating like a warning I couldn't ignore. "If you leave, you won't come back." The air in the hallway felt oppressive, heavy with something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The silence was deafening, and yet I could almost hear the soft shuffle of footsteps, too close, too deliberate. I slammed the door shut, bolting it behind me, my heart racing as the noise of the footsteps stopped. What did it mean? Was I supposed to stay here, waiting for something I couldn't predict? Or was I truly trapped, unable to leave? I needed answers, and the first person who might be able to help was Andrew. His absence, coupled with the mysterious letter, left me shaken. The fact that he hadn't answered his phone only deepened my fear. I glanced at the clock. It was nearing midnight, but something about the night felt different. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, and the lawn of the city outside felt far away, almost like I was in a different world entirely. I paced the apartment again, but this time I felt a strange compulsion to return to the bathroom. The mirror. I didn't want to go near it. I had already seen enough, but the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach told me that I couldn't ignore it. With hesitant steps, I moved toward the bathroom, my reflection staring back at me from the hallway mirror. I couldn't help but wonder what I'd see this time. Would it be that same twisted version of myself again? Or something far worse? I stepped into the bathroom and stood before the mirror, holding my breath. For a moment, there was nothing but the reflection of my tired face. My eyes, tired and wide, stared back at me. And then it began. The image in the mirror shifted again. This time, it wasn't just my face. I saw Andrew. But it wasn't the Andrew I knew. He was standing in my hallway, just outside the bathroom door. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and he was staring at me with a look of pure terror. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. My heart raced as I reached for the door, the terror I saw in his eyes urging me to open it. But when I looked back at the mirror, the image of Andrew disappeared. I turned quickly, yanking the bathroom door open. The hallway was empty. I stepped out cautiously, my hand trembling as I reached for the light switch. But the light didn't come on. The entire apartment was dark. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could still hear the faint sound of footsteps, but this time they were unmistakably behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. It felt like something was watching me, waiting. The silence pressed in on me, growing thicker, suffocating me. I had to find Andrew. I had to leave. The letters, the strange mailman, the warnings, they were all signs. But what were they leading to? I grabbed my coat again, heading for the door, but the hallway felt different. The walls seemed to close in, and every shadow seemed to move. As I stepped into the hallway, the door to my neighbor's apartment, the one across from mine, creaked open. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the doorway, stood the figure of a man. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing, and his face was obscured by the shadows. His posture was stiff, almost unnatural. He didn't speak. He just stood there, motionless, his presence like a looming threat. I backed away slowly, my pulse thundering in my ears. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The man didn't answer. Instead, he slowly stepped into the hallway, his gaze fixed on me, and without a word, he began walking toward me. I turned and ran. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All I knew was that I had to get away. I had to leave before whatever was happening caught up with me. I rushed down the stairs, the sound of my footsteps ringing in the quiet stairwell. I burst out into the street, gasping for air. The night air was cool, but it did nothing to calm my racing heart. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man from the hallway following me. But the street was empty. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady myself. The letters, the warnings, the strange occurrences, they were all connected. I couldn't escape. The man, whoever he was part of it. As I started to walk away from the building, I heard a familiar sound, the soft rustling of paper. I turned to see an envelope, slowly drifting toward me from the shadows. I reached for it with trembling hands, my breath catching in my throat. It was the same handwriting. "You shouldn't have left." I stood frozen in the street, staring at the envelope in my hands. The words on the paper blurred in my vision as a cold, paralyzing fear gripped my chest. You shouldn't have left. My fingers trembled as I folded open the envelope. It wasn't just a letter this time. Inside, there was a small, black and white photograph, one I had never seen before. It was me, but not the me I knew. In the photograph, I was standing in the same hallway of my apartment building, my face pale, my eyes wide with terror. But there was something wrong. In the corner of the image, just behind me, stood the man, tall, shadowed, and watching me. I gasped, the air catching in my throat. I knew I wasn't imagining it. The figure was real. It was the same one who had been standing in the doorway of my neighbor's apartment. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around, half expecting to see the figure behind me, lurking in the shadows. But the street was empty. It was just me and the photograph. I staggered backward, the reality of the situation crashing down on me. I couldn't escape. I couldn't hide. I looked down at the envelope again, and my stomach twisted. There was another message on the back of the photograph. The longer you wait, the harder it will be to leave. I closed my eyes, willing myself to calm down. I couldn't let fear control me, not now. I had to think. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. Taking a deep breath, I turned and ran back toward the building. I had to confront whatever was happening. I reached the entrance and shoved the door open, my footsteps echoing through the silent lobby. The air felt thick and suffocating, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The elevator was out of order. Of course. I had no choice but to take the stairs. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to climb, each step heavier than the last. When I reached the top floor, I was almost relieved to find my apartment door still locked. But then, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Had I left it open? No, I was sure I had locked it before leaving. I stepped inside cautiously, my heart racing. The apartment was eerily silent, too silent. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant murmur of the city outside, it was all gone. The only sound was my own breathing, shallow and uneven. I glanced around, my eyes scanning the room. Everything was as I had left it, except for one thing. The letters. They were scattered across the floor, as if someone had been rummaging through them. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the new one, sitting on the coffee table. It was different from the others. The paper was aged, yellowed with time, and the handwriting was much darker, more frantic. I approached it slowly, my hand shaking as I unfolded the paper. You're too late. He's already here. My heart stopped. Before I could process the words, I heard it. A sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy. They were coming from the hallway. I backed away from the table, my breath quickening. The man, the one from the photograph, was coming for me. I ran to the door, but when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the outside. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but there was no response. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I turned, desperate for another way out. The window. I could climb out. But when I reached it, I froze. The man was standing there, outside the window, staring in. His face was obscured by the darkness, but I could see his silhouette clearly, tall, imposing, and unmoving. He wasn't just watching me. He was waiting. The air grew cold, and the room seemed to shrink. It felt as though the walls were closing in around me. I was trapped. There was no way out. In the distance, I heard the faint sound of something breaking. The window. It shattered, the sound sharp and violent as the man stepped forward, his shadow growing larger. I turned and ran, but there was nowhere to go. Every step I took felt heavier, as though the very air was pushing me down. The man's footsteps echoed behind me, growing louder with each passing second. And then, as I reached the doorway, the power went out. The apartment was plunged into complete darkness. I stumbled forward, my hands reaching out in front of me, but all I could hear was his breathing, slow and steady, getting closer. I backed into the wall, trying to control my panic. But no matter where I turned, no matter how hard I tried to escape, he was always there. You shouldn't have left. His voice was soft, almost calm, but it sent a chill through me. I realized then, with sudden clarity, that I had never truly been in control. The letters, the warnings, the photographs, they were all part of the same trap. And now, it was too late to escape. I didn't scream. I couldn't. The fear had stripped away any sense of control, leaving me as a mere observer of my own terror. The darkness in the apartment felt suffocating, as though the shadows themselves were closing in on me. My heart pounded in my chest, too loud in the silence. The man's steps echoed, slow and deliberate, but somehow there was no escape, no place to hide. It felt as if the very walls of the apartment had conspired against me. I stumbled backward, feeling my legs give out beneath me, and I fell to the floor, my hands searching for something, anything, that could give me comfort, some form of resistance. But the only thing I found was the cold, unforgiving floor beneath me, slick with sweat. I could still hear him, his breath growing closer, the sound of each footfall impossibly heavy. My head was spinning. What had been happening in this apartment? What was I really running from? Suddenly, the lights flickered on, casting a harsh glow over the room. My breath hitched. In the doorway stood the man. His figure was now clearer than ever, but his face was just wrong. A patchwork of shapes and shadows, shifting and contorting like his face was not meant to be seen by human eyes. I couldn't look directly at it. It hurt, as if my mind was screaming at me to turn away, to avoid the truth that lay in that twisted reflection. He didn't move immediately. Instead, he stood there, watching, as though savoring my panic. The oppressive silence between us stretched on, broken only by the labored sound of my breathing. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. The letters. The photographs. Each warning that had come too late to stop the inevitable. Had this been happening to someone else before me? Was there a pattern? And more importantly, what was he? Who are you? My voice broke the silence, shakier than I had intended. The words slipped out of my mouth before I could stop them. He tilted his head, as though considering my question, and then, in a voice that felt too close, too familiar, he answered. "I am the one who watches," he said, his voice echoing in the room, each syllable making the hairs on my neck stand on end. "I am the one who makes sure you don't leave." His words hit me like a blow, and I felt myself gasp for air, as if his very presence was suffocating me. But the thing that chilled me most wasn't his response, it was the knowledge that he had been in control all along. I looked around the apartment. The walls, the furniture, it was all exactly how it had been the night I first received the letters. But now, it felt wrong. It felt like a prison, and I was the one trapped inside it. "You've been here before," he said suddenly, as though reading my thoughts. "Haven't you?" I swallowed hard, trying to form words, but nothing came out. The truth started to click into place, but I refused to accept it. This apartment, this life. It wasn't mine. It was a trap, a loop. Each day, the same steps. The same choices. The same fate. I had been living in a version of reality controlled by him, by the man who delivered the letters, the man who had been planting the seeds of this terror. Every night, it was the same. Each warning, each photo, each new danger, they were all part of a cycle that had no end. "I've been trying to leave," I said, my voice growing stronger despite the overwhelming fear. "But I can't." "Why? What is this place?" "You can't leave," he replied, his voice calm, unfeeling. "Because you never were supposed to. You are nothing but a spectator in your own life." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body felt paralyzed. The realization crushed me. I wasn't in control. I looked down at my hands, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw them flicker. No, it was impossible. But they flickered again. The world around me was changing, warping. Was this a dream? A nightmare? Or had it all been real? I glanced back up. The man was standing closer now, too close, and his shadow stretched across the floor like it was alive, creeping toward me. "You can't escape," he said again, the finality in his tone ringing in my ears. "No one does." I stood up quickly, driven by instinct. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't accept it. My legs felt like jelly, but I stumbled toward the door, praying, no, begging that I would find a way out. But when I reached for the handle, the door slammed shut with a force that nearly threw me off my feet. The sound of it echoed, and the silence afterward was even more deafening. My breath hitched. I was trapped. And that's when I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, slow and steady, coming from the other side of the door. He was coming. I backed away from the door, terror clawing at my chest, but I couldn't stop myself. My legs wouldn't move. I was frozen, just like before. And as he stepped into the room, his figure becoming clearer, I understood. I had never been meant to leave. I never had been. It was the light that first drew my attention. Every night, without fail, the old house at the end of our street would glow with an eerie radiance. No one ever seemed to live there, yet the lights were always on, casting a strange, unnatural hue across the decaying facade. It had been months since I first noticed it, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. The house stood silent and forgotten, a relic of the past, yet there it was, alive in the darkness. I had to know what was inside. It was impossible to ignore any longer. It was a cold autumn evening when I finally gathered the courage to investigate. The air was thick with the scent of damp leaves and the distant hum of the city. I'd spent days considering whether I should venture into the house, but something in my gut told me that tonight was the night. I felt as if the house was calling to me, urging me to enter, to discover the secret it had been hiding all this time. The street was quiet as I approached the house, its windows dark except for the faint light seeping through the curtains. The old wooden door stood ajar, as if it had been waiting for me. A shiver ran down my spine, but I couldn't turn back now. I pushed the door open with a creak that echoed through the empty space, and stepped inside. The air inside was stale, heavy with the smell of old wood and dust. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I made my way through the dark hallway, the faint glow of the light guiding me forward. It was an odd sensation, as if the house itself was alive, pulsing with an energy I couldn't quite understand. I reached the living room, where the light seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The room was filled with old photographs, their frames cracked and faded with age. Each one showed a different scene, some from a time long past, others more recent. But it wasn't the people in the photos that caught my attention, it was the light. The photos seemed to pulse with it, the glow growing stronger the longer I stared. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached out to touch one of the photographs. The moment my fingers made contact, a jolt of electricity shot through my body, and the room seemed to shift. The photographs flickered, the scenes within them coming to life, not as memories, but as something far more sinister. In one photo, a woman sat alone at a table, her face twisted in terror. In another, a man stood in the middle of the street, his arms outstretched as if begging for help, but no one was there. The light from the photos grew brighter, and I could hear faint whispers, voices from the past, calling out, warning me. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the back of the house, causing me to jump. My heart raced, and I instinctively took a step back, but my gaze remained fixed on the photographs. I couldn't look away. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the images within the frames seemed to shift, becoming more vivid, more terrifying. The woman in the photograph was now screaming, her hands pressed against the glass, as if she were begging for help. The man in the street had his mouth open, but no sound came out. And the light, it was no longer just light. It was something else, something darker. It was as if the house itself was feeding off the fear, growing stronger with each passing second. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash. I spun around, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The room seemed to close in on me, the light from the photographs intensifying, casting long, twisting shadows that stretched across the walls. The whispers turned into screams, and I could feel the temperature drop, the air growing cold and heavy. It was then that I realized this wasn't just a house. It was a trap. A place where the past was preserved, where the fear and the darkness were trapped within the walls, feeding off those who dared to enter. I had made a mistake. I shouldn't have come here. The light from the photos grew brighter still, until it consumed the room, blinding me. My body felt heavy, my legs unsteady as I stumbled backward. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. But there was no sense to it, no explanation. I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me, soft and slow, as if someone, or something, was drawing closer. I didn't dare look back. The fear was too much, the weight of it crushing me. I ran. I don't know how long I ran through the dark house, my feet pounding against the creaky floorboards, my heart racing in my chest. I couldn't escape the light. It was everywhere, surrounding me, chasing me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light flickered and went out. The house fell into an oppressive, suffocating darkness. I stopped in my tracks, the silence deafening. I had no idea where I was, or how I had gotten there. I could still hear the whispers, still feel the presence of something behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see what was there. The door, I had to find the door. I fumbled in the dark, my fingers brushing against the walls, desperate to find an exit. Finally, I found it. I yanked the door open and stumbled into the night air, gasping for breath. The light from the house still glowed faintly behind me, casting long shadows across the street. I didn't look back. I never went near the house again. But every night, from the comfort of my own home, I could see the light flickering in the distance, a reminder that some secrets are meant to stay buried. And I could never escape the whispers. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still watching me, even though I had left it behind. The light, it stayed in my mind, flickering like a broken beacon. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those photographs, those faces contorted in terror. They haunted me, each one more vivid than the last. And those whispers, they never stopped. It was as if they followed me, clinging to the edges of my thoughts, pulling me back. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I had been startled by the strange atmosphere of the house, that the fear had twisted my perception. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something wrong with that place. Something I couldn't understand. That evening, as the sun began to set and the air grew cool, I stood at my window, looking across the street at the old house. The light was on again, as it always was. This time, though, I didn't feel the same pull to go back. No matter how much my curiosity gnawed at me, I knew better. I had seen enough. But even with that resolve, I found myself pacing around my apartment, unable to focus on anything else. The walls felt too close, the silence too loud. It was like the house's presence was still in my bones, still whispering in my ears. I tried to push the thought away, tried to drown it out with the noise of the television or the sound of music. But nothing helped. The light was there, calling to me. At some point, I found myself standing at the front door of my building, my hand on the doorknob. I couldn't remember how I had gotten there. The decision to leave was almost automatic. I was out on the street before I even realized what I was doing, heading in the direction of the house. I tried to stop myself, to turn back. But my legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the door of the old house as if some invisible force had taken control of me. When I reached the front gate, I hesitated. The house was darker now, its windows reflecting the last bit of sunlight as the sky began to darken. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing, my breath shallow. There was something deeply unsettling about the house, something that made my skin crawl, but at the same time, there was a magnetic pull that I couldn't resist. I pushed the gate open, and the sound of the hinges screeching made me wince. The familiar feeling of dread washed over me, but I couldn't stop. I walked toward the door again, the same one that had been open when I first entered. But this time, it wasn't open. The door was shut tight, the dark shadows of the hallway beyond it now hidden behind solid wood. I reached for the doorknob, only to find it locked. A small part of me felt relieved. Maybe it was for the best. Maybe I shouldn't be here. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I noticed something strange, something that made my blood run cold. A faint light flickered from the crack beneath the door. I stood frozen, staring at the light, my heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't the same soft glow I had seen from the street. This light was brighter, more urgent, as if it were calling me back. I knew I shouldn't, but I found myself reaching for the door again, trying to turn the handle. It wasn't locked anymore. The door creaked open slowly, as if it had been waiting for me to come back. The same musty smell hit me immediately, along with the familiar chill that seemed to hang in the air like a shroud. I stepped inside, the darkness pressing in on all sides. The light, flickering from the room at the end of the hallway, was still there, but now it felt different. It wasn't just light. It was a presence. I walked forward cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I neared the living room, I noticed something new. There were no photographs on the walls. The room was bare, except for a few pieces of old furniture covered in dust. But in the center of the room, there was a large, ornate mirror, and inside it, a figure was standing. At first, I thought it was my reflection, but then I saw the details. The figure in the mirror was different. It was me, yes, but it was twisted, distorted, its face pale and hollow, eyes wide and empty. I took a step back, horrified, but the reflection didn't move. It just stared at me, unblinking. I reached out, my hand trembling, and the moment my fingers touched the glass, a sharp jolt of pain shot through my body. I gasped, pulling my hand back. The reflection, however, didn't flinch. It remained still, its eyes locked on mine, as if it were waiting for something. My heart raced, and panic began to set in. I knew I had to leave, but my body wouldn't respond. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. The figure in the reflection, the twisted version of me, slowly raised its hand as if it were beckoning me. Before I could react, the whispers started again, louder this time, echoing through the room. They were not just in my head. They filled the air, growing stronger with each passing second. The light in the room flickered violently, casting long, jerky shadows across the walls. The whispers, they were coming from the mirror. I stumbled backward, and in that moment, the reflection in the mirror grinned. It was not a smile of recognition, it was a grin of malice, of something far darker. The whispers turned into laughter, low and guttural, and the room seemed to close in on me. I had to leave, but I couldn't move. The light, the reflection, was all that existed now. And I realized, in that horrifying instant, that I had never truly left. The house had taken me, just as it had taken everyone before me. And I was never going to escape. The laughter faded, but the sensation of the room closing in on me only intensified. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, a frantic drumbeat that urged me to escape, to run. But my legs felt paralyzed, as if the air itself had turned to concrete, holding me in place. The reflection in the mirror grinned wider, its hollow eyes staring through me, not at me. I tried to scream, but the sound got lost in the heavy silence that followed. The walls seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, like they were alive, watching, waiting. It was as though the house itself was breathing, drawing me in, suffocating me with its presence. I blinked, hoping the image in the mirror would vanish, but instead, it seemed to distort even further. The figure in the glass moved now, its fingers twitching unnaturally, as if testing the limits of its reflection. A sickening crack echoed through the room, and I flinched, my skin crawling at the sound. "Get out," I whispered to myself, the words barely leaving my lips. But the air seemed to absorb them, rendering them useless. I took a step back, trembling, but the reflection did not move with me. It remained fixed, still smiling that twisted, cruel smile. It was as if it were mocking me, reminding me that I was trapped in this house, trapped in this nightmare that had no end. But then, something changed. A faint shadow shifted in the corner of the room, just a flicker at first, nothing more than a distortion in the air. I turned, my eyes widening, but the shadow disappeared before I could fully focus on it. My breath caught in my throat as I scanned the room, searching for any sign of movement. I was not alone. The silence returned, but this time it felt different. It was heavier, thick with anticipation, like something or someone was watching from the corners, from the dark places where the light couldn't reach. I swallowed hard, pushing myself forward despite the paralyzing fear. Each step felt like a monumental effort, my legs barely responding to my commands. But I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in the room with that thing in the mirror. I tore my gaze away from the reflection, forcing myself to look at the door, the only way out. The hallway behind it was empty, nothing but darkness. But the light from the other room still flickered, beckoning me, drawing me toward it. I was so close to the door now. I could feel the cool metal of the doorknob against my palm, but before I could turn it, a sudden sound broke the silence. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, almost methodical. They came from behind me, coming closer, echoing in the vast emptiness of the house. I froze, my breath caught in my chest. It wasn't possible. There was no one else here. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, closer, until I could feel the weight of each step pressing down on me. My heart raced, my pulse pounding in my ears, as I turned slowly, afraid of what I might see. And there, standing just beyond the doorway, was a figure. Its shape was vague, shrouded in shadows, but its presence was undeniable. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its body thin and elongated, like a stretch of dark smoke that had taken form. Its face was hidden, but the emptiness that radiated from it filled the room with an icy chill. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. The figure didn't speak, didn't make a sound, it simply stood there, watching me. Its presence felt oppressive, like it was pushing down on me, forcing me to remain still, to remain trapped. The footsteps stopped. And then, with a sudden, sharp crack, the door slammed shut. I jolted back, the noise reverberating through my body like a shockwave. My pulse quickened, my eyes wide with terror. The room, no, the house itself, seemed to be alive now, moving, shifting around me. The walls groaned, and the floor beneath me creaked ominously. I could feel the house growing, expanding, enclosing me in its dark embrace. The figure in the doorway began to move. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, as if it were made of shadows rather than flesh. I didn't dare look away, but my mind screamed for me to run. I couldn't. I couldn't move. It stepped closer, its face still hidden in the shadows, and I felt the air around me grow colder with each passing second. I tried to take a step back, but I was rooted to the spot. My legs shook violently, my breath shallow and ragged. And then I heard it. A whisper, so faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second until it filled the room, filled my mind. "Leave," it said, the voice low and guttural, like it came from deep within the earth. "Leave, before it's too late." I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. The darkness was closing in. The figure took another step toward me, its eyes glowing now, burning through the darkness like twin points of light. And the whispering grew louder, more urgent. "Leave, leave, leave now." I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. The house, the figure, the light, they were all part of something much bigger, something that wanted me trapped, forever. And with one final surge of adrenaline, I forced myself to move. I broke free from the paralysis, darting toward the door, my hand slamming into the handle, twisting it open. The room behind me screamed in fury, the air thick with anger. The footsteps, the whispering, the light, it all seemed to chase me, pulling at my heels as I ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I burst out of the house, my heart hammering in my chest. The night air hit me like a wall of cold, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The door slammed shut behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, the whispers still echoing in my mind, the cold darkness of the house lingering on my skin. I had escaped. For now. But something told me I wasn't done with that house. Not yet. I didn't stop running. Not until the house was out of sight, swallowed by the night and the darkness that surrounded it. My legs burned, my breath was ragged, and the weight of the silence pressed down on me, but I kept moving, as though the further I got from that place, the safer I would be. But the whispering hadn't stopped. It lingered in my mind, an echo that refused to fade, a constant reminder that I had only escaped physically. I didn't understand what was happening, but it felt as though the house was still there, its presence following me, always just beyond the edge of my thoughts. I didn't even know where I was going. The streets blurred around me, the familiar buildings and landmarks turning into an indistinct haze. I couldn't focus on anything other than the feeling of being pursued. That constant sense that the house wasn't done with me yet. I finally stumbled into a small park, my knees weak, and collapsed onto the nearest bench, gasping for air. The cold night air did nothing to calm the tremors that ran through me. My fingers were numb, and the chill in the air seemed to settle deep into my bones. The lights of the city around me felt far away, distant, as though I had stepped into a different world altogether. I tried to steady myself, taking slow, deep breaths, forcing my mind to focus. I had to think. I couldn't let the panic take over. I had to understand what had happened. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something. A figure standing across the park at the far end of the walkway, just barely illuminated by the dim streetlights. I froze. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow that my eyes had made of the trees or a bench. But the figure didn't move. It stood there, perfectly still, as if waiting. And even though I couldn't make out its features from this distance, I knew it was watching me. I turned away, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. The same feeling I had when I first saw that light in the house, when I first heard the whispers. I had to get out of here. The figure in the distance, the park, it didn't matter. I had to leave. But as I stood, the air shifted. The temperature dropped even further, the chill biting at my skin. The whispering returned, louder now, so close that it felt like someone was standing right next to me, breathing down my neck. I turned back to face the figure, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment our eyes met, I felt it. A wave of icy fear crashed over me, and for the briefest moment, I saw its face, a pale, gaunt figure with hollow eyes and a mouth that hung open as though it were waiting for me to speak. But I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, the figure stepped forward, its movement jerky, unnatural. The shadows around it seemed to writhe, like they were alive, crawling across the ground toward me. It moved closer, each step sending a shock of terror through my veins. I knew then it was not just a figure. It was something else. Something that had been drawn to me by the house. The whispering grew louder, filling my mind with a cold, oppressive voice. Leave, leave, before it takes you. I didn't know if it was the figure speaking or the house, or something far worse. But the words were clear, and they chilled me to my core. Without thinking, I ran. I didn't look back, didn't dare to see what was chasing me. My feet pounded against the pavement, my body moving on pure instinct, propelled by the primal need to escape. The figure didn't follow me directly, but I could feel it there, just behind me, lurking in the shadows, watching my every move. The air felt thick, heavy, as though the world itself was pressing in around me, closing in tighter with each step I took. I didn't know how long I ran, but eventually, I found myself in a familiar neighborhood. I slowed, panting, my breath clouding in the frigid air. The streets here felt like a sanctuary, the warm glow of nearby houses offering a brief illusion of safety. I stopped at the foot of my building, my legs shaking as I pressed my back against the cool brick. I looked up, my gaze scanning the windows, hoping for some semblance of normality. But when my eyes fell on the apartment above mine, my blood ran cold. The light was on. Not just on, it was glowing, bright and unnatural, spilling from the windows like it had come from somewhere deep within the walls of the building itself. I hadn't seen the light on my left. I was sure of it. A shiver ran down my spine. My heart skipped a beat. I stepped forward, cautiously. Each footstep felt like it carried me further into the nightmare I was desperate to escape. As I neared the entrance, the whispering returned, louder now, echoing in the air around me, filling every corner of my mind. Come back. You cannot escape. It is already too late. I stood frozen at the doorway, staring at the building, unsure if I should turn and run or enter. The light from the windows flickered, casting an eerie glow over the sidewalk. I didn't want to go back inside. I couldn't. But as I stood there, I knew something deeper, something worse, was waiting for me. The door opened by itself, the handle twisting as if an unseen force were beckoning me inside. The air turned colder still, and I heard the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway, slow, deliberate, as though they were coming for me. I was trapped. Again. I took a breath and stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind me, and the darkness took over. The darkness inside the building was suffocating, oppressive. The moment the door slammed shut behind me, the atmosphere shifted, the air thick with something sinister. I couldn't tell where the light was coming from, but it illuminated the hallway in a soft, almost ghostly glow. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, as if the building itself were alive and aware of my presence. Every step I took seemed to echo, a hollow, chilling sound that only added to the unease gnawing at me. I didn't want to move. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run back out into the night where the air felt freer, where the streets offered some semblance of safety. But the door was shut now, the lock clicking into place behind me. There was no going back. I could hear them now, the whispers. They were softer, as if they were waiting for me to listen, but the words were still clear, distant, and hollow. You're not alone, the voice hissed. It's all connected. The hallway stretched before me, leading to the stairs, the faint light illuminating the walls adorned with old, peeling wallpaper. I could barely make out the images on the walls. But there was something about them, something wrong. They seemed to shift while I wasn't looking directly at them. Faces appeared in the corners of frames, eyes that blinked, mouths that moved, even though no one was there. I swallowed hard, trying to shake the feeling that the walls themselves were watching me. The whispering continued, as though the house was trying to communicate with me, pulling me deeper into its secrets. I had to find the source of the light. I had to know what was going on, or I would lose my mind. I took a step forward, and the floorboards groaned beneath me, as though protesting my presence. The air grew colder, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. The light at the end of the hallway flickered again, and I felt an invisible force urging me toward it. But I hesitated. Something felt off. The building didn't want me to leave. The whispering was louder now, almost deafening, and the shadows seemed to shift with each passing second. I had no idea what was waiting for me, but I knew I had to push forward. I had to. As I reached the stairs, the whispers quieted, leaving only a deafening silence in their wake. The stairs loomed before me, dark and narrow, each step seemingly deeper into the unknown. I moved slowly, cautiously, every fiber of my being screaming to stop. But I couldn't. I had already gone too far to turn back. I reached the second floor, and the light grew brighter, more intense. The hallway here was different, less worn, as though the house had somehow preserved it. The floor was pristine, the walls lined with photographs in frames. Photographs of people I didn't know. But as I got closer to the end of the hall, my heart stopped. There, at the end of the hallway, was a door. And the light, it was coming from behind it. I stood there, staring at the door. I could feel the heat of the light seeping through the cracks around the frame, and it made my skin prickle with an unnatural warmth. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a low hum that vibrated through the air. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling, but before I could turn it, the door creaked open on its own. The room was bathed in light, too much light. It was overwhelming, the brightness burning into my eyes, making it hard to see. But I could make out shapes, figures moving inside. Not just people, things. Shadows and faces that shouldn't be there, lurking in the corners of the room, watching me. I stepped inside, my legs shaking, my breath shallow. The room was filled with photographs, hundreds of them, covering every wall. Some were old, others newer, but all of them showed the same thing: people. Faces. All of them staring at the camera, but in every photograph, something was wrong. The expressions weren't right. The smiles were too wide, the eyes too vacant, and in the corners of many of the pictures, there were figures, shadowy shapes that didn't belong. I stumbled back, my pulse racing. But it was too late. As I moved, I knocked one of the pictures off the wall. The glass shattered as it hit the floor, and the instant it did, the light flared up, blinding me. I tried to shield my eyes, but it was no use. The light grew brighter, filling the room with a harsh, pulsating glow, and the air around me crackled with static. The shadows seemed to move, to shift and coil around the photographs, like they were alive. I stumbled back, my hands scraping against the wall, desperate for a way out. But the door was gone. The hallway, the stairs, everything was gone. I was trapped in this room, surrounded by eyes, by figures I couldn't escape. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the light dimmed. The room fell into darkness, and the whispering returned, louder now, closer than ever. "Welcome," it said, a voice that wasn't a voice at all, but something more, something ancient. "You're one of us now." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The walls closed in on me, and the shadows reached out, touching my skin, pulling me toward them. And I knew, deep down, that I would never escape. Have you ever woken up and felt like the day had already started before your eyes opened? Like you already lived through every moment, but you just couldn't place when? That's how it all began. One ordinary morning when nothing felt quite right. And I didn't even notice it at first. It wasn't a grand shift. It was subtle, like the shifting of the wind on a quiet day, so soft you could almost convince yourself it wasn't happening at all. The sun was rising through my window, its light spilling across the floor. My alarm rang, blaring, annoying, relentless. I reached for it and hit snooze, just like I did every morning. And then, everything began to fall into place, except it didn't. The events that followed, the usual routine, the same conversations, the same breakfast, I should have felt comforted by their familiarity, but instead, I felt uneasy, like something was wrong. It wasn't until I stepped outside, heading for work, that I saw the first hint of strangeness. The man on the corner, the one who always wore the worn-out coat and stood by the bus stop, today, he wasn't there. In his place stood a woman. A stranger. She was holding a strange, black umbrella, her face obscured by her dark hair. She looked out of place, yet somehow familiar. I tried to shake off the odd feeling. I continued with my day, just as I always did, but with each hour that passed, more things felt off. Small things, like a car parked in the wrong spot, or the way someone spoke to me with words that didn't match the expression on their face. I brushed it all aside, told myself it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. When I returned home that evening, something was different in my apartment. It was subtle at first. The books on the shelf had shifted, the mug I left on the counter was in a different spot. I checked my phone, expecting to see the usual time, but the screen showed a date I hadn't noticed before. A date that shouldn't have been. It wasn't just a new day. It was the same day. The same day that had begun hours ago. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was hallucinating, but when I stepped outside again, I saw it. The woman at the bus stop was back. She was holding the black umbrella. She was still standing in the same spot. I froze. The same woman. The same umbrella. The same spot. And then I heard it. The sound of footsteps behind me. Too close. Too deliberate. But when I turned around, there was no one there. The world around me was repeating. The day, the people, the places. All of it. And I was caught in a loop. I didn't know how it had started. Or why. But I knew that if I didn't break free, I would be trapped in this endless cycle, forever repeating the same moments, forever doomed to relive my worst fears. Each time the day reset, I found new details. A flicker of something in the corner of my eye. A whisper that didn't belong to anyone. At times, I could feel something, someone, watching me. Waiting. The repetition grew more intense. The subtle shifts became more pronounced. And with each cycle, I found myself becoming more desperate, more frantic, as I tried to figure out the source of this loop. Each time, I tried to take a different path, make different choices. But nothing ever changed. The woman with the umbrella was always there. The footsteps always followed. By the fifth cycle, I could hardly remember what was real anymore. The line between what was happening and what I feared would happen was blurring. I didn't know if I was imagining it or if it was really happening. I couldn't trust my own mind. I thought I had found a way to break free, but each time, the same day repeated itself. A new detail, a new twist. But it was always the same. I couldn't escape it. And then I realized the truth. The woman, the footsteps, the strange sense of déjà vu, it wasn't just the day repeating itself. It was me. I was the one stuck in the loop. The reason things felt so wrong, so distorted, was because I was the anomaly. I had been the one who was out of place. I was the one who didn't belong in this reality. And now, I was trapped. The day would never end. I would never escape. I woke up again. The same morning. The same light coming through the window. The same blaring alarm. I hit the snooze button, just like before, though this time I felt a growing sense of dread. This wasn't just a bad dream. I knew it wasn't. It couldn't be. The weight of the same day pressing down on me made everything feel hollow. I could barely bring myself to get out of bed. But I did. There was no choice. The day had begun, whether I liked it or not. I moved through the motions, getting dressed, brushing my teeth, eating breakfast, but every action felt like it was happening without me. It was mechanical, predictable. I was stuck in a cycle, forced to repeat these same movements again and again. I had no control over it. I tried not to think about it. I tried to act like everything was normal, but there was a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't normal. The world felt wrong. When I stepped outside, I expected to see the same people on the street. The man at the bus stop, the woman who always walked her dog in the same direction. I didn't expect the strange woman with the black umbrella to be there again. But she was. I could feel her eyes on me, even from across the street. I wasn't imagining it. She was watching me. I didn't know how or why, but I could feel it in my bones. I quickened my pace, trying to avoid her gaze. I reached for my phone, my hand shaking as I checked the time. The date. And there it was again. The same date. The same hour. I hadn't moved forward at all. This wasn't a normal day. It was the same day, and I was stuck in it. I kept walking, trying to distract myself, trying to find something, anything, that could break this strange loop. But the longer I walked, the more I noticed the small things, the way the wind felt the same, the way the leaves on the trees moved in exactly the same pattern as before. I couldn't escape it. It was everywhere. The repetition. The staleness. I thought about talking to someone, maybe even telling them what was happening, but who would believe me? The world was still the same. It was only me who could see it, the loop, the repetition, the small details that didn't fit. I was losing my mind. As I passed the bus stop again, the woman with the umbrella was still there. She hadn't moved an inch. Her presence was like a constant reminder of my inability to break free. I wanted to shout at her, ask her why she was there, what was going on. But I knew she wouldn't answer. It wasn't that kind of situation. She was just a part of the pattern. Just another detail I couldn't escape. I tried to retrace my steps, to find a way out of this cycle. I even took a different route, walking around the block, hoping something would change. But it didn't. Everything was the same. The same people. The same buildings. The same events. I felt the weight of it all pressing in on me. The walls closing in. My chest felt tight. My mind raced. How was I supposed to break free when every path I took led me right back to the beginning? And then, as I walked past the corner near the bakery, I heard the footsteps again. Too close. They were behind me. Always behind me. But when I turned around, there was no one there. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow. The footsteps were there. I was certain of it. But where were they coming from? Why couldn't I see them? I quickened my pace, my anxiety rising with each passing moment. The footsteps kept following, the sound echoing in my mind. I didn't know how much longer I could take this. The day, the time, it was all slipping away from me. Was this real? Was I dreaming? Or was I truly trapped in some kind of nightmare? I turned the corner, hoping for some kind of change, but nothing was different. Everything was the same. I was running in circles. And no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried to break the pattern, it was always the same. The day kept resetting. The footsteps kept following. And the woman with the black umbrella stood there, waiting for me to figure it out. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out of here. The sound of those footsteps, their relentless echo against the pavement, had become the only thing I could focus on. It was like they were attached to me, creeping ever closer, and no matter how fast I walked or how many turns I took, they were always there, just behind me. I needed to find a way to stop this, to break this cycle. It felt as if the entire world had become a blur, a distorted version of itself, replaying the same day over and over. But why? What had I done? What was the reason for this madness? My mind was racing. I thought back to everything that had happened this morning. What had changed? Was there something different about today? I couldn't remember. It all felt the same, but I knew something was wrong, something I had missed. The streets felt emptier now. Fewer people were walking, as though the world was withdrawing into itself. The air had turned colder, and the sky had taken on a dull gray hue, even though it was only midday. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something terrible. I looked around, trying to spot something, anything, that might provide a clue. And then I saw her again. The woman with the black umbrella. She was standing at the same corner, the same position she had been in when I passed by earlier. But now, as I walked closer, she wasn't just standing there. She was looking at me. Not just glancing, she was staring, her eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I froze, my feet planted to the ground. My breath caught in my throat. She tilted her head slightly, as if examining me, studying me in a way that sent a shiver down my spine. Her gaze was unnerving, almost knowing, like she understood what I was experiencing, like she knew why I was trapped in this endless loop. Without thinking, I took a step towards her. Maybe she had the answers. Maybe she could tell me what was happening, why this day kept repeating, why I was stuck in this nightmare. I didn't know what I expected, but it felt like the only way out. As I approached her, the footsteps behind me grew louder, more urgent, as if they were closing in, as if they knew I was about to make a choice. The woman didn't move. She didn't speak. But as I got closer, I noticed something strange, something terrifying. Her shadow, it wasn't right. It was stretching, shifting unnaturally, as though it was trying to break free from her. It twisted and writhed in ways that didn't belong in the real world. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to look away, but I couldn't. It was like the shadow had a life of its own, trying to reach for me. I took another step back, my body trembling. This wasn't just a normal person. She wasn't normal. And her shadow, it was as if it had its own intentions, its own will. It wasn't just following her, it was reaching for me. In a panic, I spun around to leave, but that's when I heard it, the footsteps, now accompanied by a soft whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound was unmistakable. It was like the world itself was whispering to me, urging me to listen, to understand. I turned back toward the woman, desperate for any answer, any explanation. But she was gone. In her place, there was just the umbrella, lying on the ground. The shadow was gone too. And yet, the whispering continued, rising in volume until it filled my ears. The footsteps were there again, too, but they were no longer just behind me. They were all around me, closing in, surrounding me. There was no escape. I ran. I didn't look back. My feet pounded against the pavement, my chest tight with fear, my breath shallow. I couldn't think straight. I needed to get out. I needed to escape this endless cycle. But no matter how fast I ran, how far I went, I always ended up back at the same corner, facing the same street, the same set of buildings. The same woman, no, she wasn't there anymore, but I could feel her presence lingering, as though she were watching me from the shadows. The sky had grown darker. The city had become quieter, emptier. As if I were the only one left, trapped in this repeating nightmare, while the rest of the world had slipped away. I wanted to scream, but I knew it wouldn't help. It was just me now. Just me and the footsteps. The footsteps that had never stopped. I tried to stop running. I tried to think, to make sense of it all, but my mind was too clouded with fear. How was I supposed to break free? How was I supposed to fix this? The world was crumbling around me, and I was powerless to stop it. Then I heard the voice again. This time, it was clearer. You've been here before. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I had been here before. But the voice wasn't coming from anywhere around me. It was coming from inside my head. Inside my very mind. You have to remember, it whispered. Remember the key. The key. What key? I didn't understand. But it was like a flicker in the back of my mind, a distant memory, something I had missed. I closed my eyes, desperate for clarity. The key. The key. What was it? And then it hit me. The woman with the black umbrella, she was the key. She wasn't just a random figure. She was part of the loop. Part of the puzzle I had to solve. I had to find her again. I had to confront her. But where had she gone? I opened my eyes, looking frantically around, but there was no sign of her. Just the whispering. And the footsteps. The world felt heavier now, as if time itself was pressing down on me. The more I tried to make sense of it, the more chaotic everything became. I had to find her. The woman. The one with the umbrella. She held the answer, at least, that's what the voice in my head kept telling me. But she was nowhere to be found. I stood on the corner of the same street, the city around me looking exactly like it had moments ago. The same buildings. The same gray sky. The same muted sounds of traffic in the distance. But it felt different, as though the air had thickened with dread. As though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I walked, my feet carrying me forward without thinking. The steps, always in the background, seemed to follow me, but now they weren't just footsteps. They were becoming more deliberate, more forceful, like they were trying to push me in a specific direction. Towards something. Or someone. I turned a corner, my mind racing with thoughts of the woman. I needed to understand what she was, why she was here, and what connection she had to this endless cycle. And then it hit me, something I hadn't considered before. What if she wasn't just a person? What if she was part of this loop? Part of the reason the day kept repeating? The thought was chilling. If the woman was part of this loop, if she had some connection to whatever force was trapping me in this cycle, then confronting her wasn't going to be enough. She might be the key, but she wasn't the answer. I stopped in my tracks. The footsteps stopped too. I turned, scanning the street, desperate to find something, anything that could break me free from this nightmare. The city was eerily silent now. Too silent. Then, I saw it. A figure standing in the distance. Far down the street, at the very end. The woman with the umbrella. She was there. I could feel my heart race, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, my body paralyzed by a mixture of fear and something else, something deeper, more primal. It was like I had been waiting for this moment, even though I hadn't consciously known it. Like I had known she would be there. The voice in my head returned, soft but clear. You're close now, but it's not what you think. I didn't understand. I wanted to scream, to demand answers. But all I could do was stand there, staring at the figure in the distance. She wasn't moving. She was just standing there, her umbrella held firmly at her side, her eyes fixed on me, though I couldn't make out her expression from this far away. I started walking again, slowly at first, then faster, urgency building in my chest. I needed to get to her. I needed to break free from this cycle, to understand why this day kept repeating, to understand what had gone wrong. But the closer I got, the more distorted the world around me became. The buildings seemed to shift, their outlines blurring as if they were being viewed through a fogged window. The ground beneath my feet felt unstable, like it was undulating with every step I took. The woman remained still, watching, waiting. I reached the spot where I had seen her, but she was gone. The street was empty again. I stood there, panting, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of her, but there was nothing. Just the emptiness, just the endless repetition of the same streets, the same corner, the same buildings. And then I heard it, the whispering. Faint at first, but growing louder until it was like the very air was filled with it. It surrounded me, closed in on me, echoing in my ears. You're not ready. The voice was sharp now, more insistent. I spun around, trying to locate the source, but it was everywhere. I was suffocating in it. And that's when I saw something else. A figure, just like before, standing at the very end of the street. The woman. But now, she wasn't alone. There were others with her, figures cloaked in shadow, their faces obscured, but their presence unmistakable. They were standing in the same formation as before, but now they were looking at me, their eyes glowing in the dim light. I could feel the weight of their gaze, heavy and judgmental. The woman with the umbrella stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. As she did, the shadows around her seemed to grow longer, stretching out towards me, as if they were reaching for me. You don't understand, the voice whispered, but it wasn't just inside my head anymore. It was coming from everywhere, from all directions, surrounding me like a thick fog. This is your doing. You've created this. I took a step back, but the shadows pressed closer. They were closing in on me, surrounding me in a ring. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the weight of their gaze, like they were waiting for me to understand something, something important. But I didn't understand. I didn't know what was happening, what I had done. All I knew was that I was trapped, caught in this cycle of repetition, and the more I struggled, the tighter the loop seemed to tighten around me. Remember, the voice urged again. Remember the key. I reached out, my hand trembling as I tried to grasp the truth, the key to breaking free. But all I could see was the woman, standing there with her umbrella, surrounded by shadows, and the whispering that would never stop. And then, as I reached for her, everything went dark. I woke up again. The same day. The same feeling of dread sinking into my chest the moment I opened my eyes. I had felt it before, so many times now, but each time it felt more suffocating, more real. The moment of recognition was like a punch to the gut, another day that wouldn't end until I figured it out. But what was I supposed to figure out? I looked around my room, the familiar sights offering no comfort anymore. The clock on the wall showed the same time it always did when this started, 8 o'clock in the morning. I didn't need to check the time to know. I had memorized every minute, every second of this endless loop. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic outside, the soft creak of the floorboards, all of it was as predictable as the rising sun. But something had changed. The air was heavier today, as if the room itself knew the game was up. I had to break free. I couldn't let this continue, couldn't let this nightmare drag on. But how? I tried to leave, but as soon as I stepped outside, the familiar streets greeted me with the same unsettling silence. The people around me were moving, but it felt as if they were actors in a play, going through the motions, unaware of the loop we were all trapped in. But then, I saw her. The woman with the umbrella. She was standing in the same spot, at the end of the street. Just like before. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, it felt like she was seeing me for the first time, like she knew who I was, what I was. I couldn't move. Every time I tried to take a step, my feet felt rooted to the ground, heavy, unwilling to obey. The woman tilted her head slightly, as if she was waiting for something. Waiting for me to do something, anything, to break the silence, to acknowledge the truth. That voice, spoke again. This time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command, clear and sharp. You have to remember. Remember? Remember what? I had been trying to understand for so long, trying to find the key that would unlock this nightmare. But what if the key wasn't something I needed to find? What if it was something I had already known, buried deep within my mind? I closed my eyes, blocking out the world around me, and tried to think. Tried to remember. What had changed? What had triggered this cycle, this endless loop? And then it came to me. The photo. The photograph in my apartment. The one I had seen only once, the one that I had dismissed as insignificant at first. It had been on the wall in the hallway, hidden in plain sight. A black and white picture of a street corner, the same street corner where I had seen the woman for the first time. I had walked past it countless times, never giving it a second thought. But now, I realized that the photo had been there the whole time, as though it had been planted as a reminder, a clue to something I couldn't yet understand. I turned and ran. The street was a blur as I sprinted back toward my apartment. The voices, the shadows, were starting to close in again, but I didn't care. I had to find that photograph. It was the only way. I burst through the door, my heart pounding in my chest, and rushed down the hallway to the wall where the photo had hung. But there was nothing there. The wall was bare, the frame gone. Panic set in. I was running out of time. The loop was closing in on me, and the shadows, the whispers, the woman with the umbrella, they were all converging on this moment, waiting for me to finally break, to accept whatever this was. But then, I saw it. Beneath the dust on the floor, a small corner of paper was sticking out. I reached down, trembling, and pulled it out. It was the photograph. But it wasn't just any photo. The moment I held it in my hands, the world shifted. The room seemed to fade away, the edges of the walls blurring as though they were being erased. I could feel the weight of something ancient pressing down on me, something that had been here long before me and would remain long after. The woman's face, now clearly visible in the photo, was no longer just a figure on a distant street corner. She was looking directly at me. Her eyes locked with mine, and in that instant, everything became clear. This wasn't a loop. This was a trap. A trap set by me. I had been the one to create it, to bind myself to this day, this moment, because somewhere deep inside, I had known the answer all along. I had created this cycle to avoid facing the truth. And now, as the shadows crept closer, as the voice whispered its final warning, you can't escape yourself, I understood. This wasn't a day that repeated. This was the end of the day. The day I would finally confront the choices I had made, the things I had buried in my past. The woman with the umbrella wasn't a stranger. She was me. The version of me that I had tried to forget. And now, I had no choice but to face her. To face myself. The photo dissolved in my hands, the room collapsing around me, and I knew this time it was over. There was no escape. I had no idea how they ended up in my pocket. I was sitting in my usual corner of the cafe, nursing a cold cup of coffee, staring at the small wooden table in front of me. The door to the cafe opened, and a gust of chilly air swept inside. I glanced up just as the door closed behind a customer who had been sitting across from me. As my eyes returned to the table, something caught my attention. A small, worn bunch of keys sitting neatly in the middle of the table. They were old, some tarnished with age, others almost shiny, as though they had recently been touched. There were 5 of them, each with a different shape and design, but all of them had one thing in common: they didn't belong to me. I looked around quickly, wondering if someone had dropped them, but the cafe was empty now, the last customer gone. I picked them up, feeling the cold metal in my hand. No one had been sitting here long enough for these to be forgotten. I looked at the keys again, the strange weight of them pulling at me. My first thought was to give them to the barista. But then, something stopped me. The longer I held the keys, the more I wanted to keep them. I didn't understand why, but there was a pull, an inexplicable connection between them and me. Something deep down told me that I had to hold on to them. I shoved them into my jacket pocket, paid for my coffee, and left the cafe. The day seemed ordinary, or as ordinary as a Tuesday could be. The sky was overcast, the streets busy with commuters, the hum of city life moving like a steady stream. But as I walked down the street, I started feeling it, a strange sensation that I couldn't shake. The kind of feeling you get when you're being watched or followed. I walked faster, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at the back of my mind, but my eyes kept darting to the alleyways and dark corners, as though expecting something to emerge. The feeling grew worse as I passed a narrow street I didn't recognize, a street that was unfamiliar even though I had lived in this city for years. It was like a part of it had suddenly appeared, an extension of the city I had never seen before. A strange little door, set into the side of a brick building, caught my eye. Without thinking, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the keys. I don't know why I did it. I didn't plan to, but somehow, my hand reached for the one that looked like it might fit. My fingers brushed against the cold metal, and as I held it in my hand, a strange pulse of energy ran through me. I walked up to the door, heart racing, my breath coming faster now. I didn't stop to wonder why I was doing this, or what the door could possibly lead to. Something inside me whispered that this was where I was supposed to be, that this was the first step towards something I was meant to uncover. I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. The door opened. I stepped inside. The room was dark, save for the faint light coming from a cracked window. The air smelled damp, like mildew and dust. It was a small room, and at first, I thought it was empty. But then I saw them, photographs, lined up along the walls. Strange, disturbing photographs. I couldn't make out the details at first, the light too dim, but as my eyes adjusted, I began to see what they were. People. Or, at least, they looked like people. But their eyes were all wrong. Hollow, empty, like they were staring into something far beyond the room. A chill ran down my spine. I backed away from the walls, but as I turned to leave, I heard a sound. A soft thump, like footsteps. But there was no one behind me. No one in the room. My heart pounded, and I turned again to face the dark corner of the room, my mind racing. The air grew heavier, the room colder, and then another thump. This time closer. I knew I wasn't alone anymore. Panic surged through me. I needed to leave, but I couldn't move. My legs felt frozen in place, my hand gripped tightly around the key. The sound was growing louder now, and I could hear the faint rustle of something dragging across the floor, something moving closer. I wanted to scream, but my throat closed up. I reached for the door handle, but it was gone. The door had disappeared, leaving nothing but smooth, cold stone behind it. The photographs seemed to shift and change, their eyes watching me, following my every movement. The air thickened, and a whisper ran through the room, cold and urgent. "You shouldn't have come." I tried to shake the voice from my mind, but the words echoed, filling the room with an oppressive weight. My chest tightened, and I realized the key hadn't just opened a door. It had opened something else. Something far more dangerous. I turned around, searching for a way out, but there was nothing. Just more shadows, more whispers, and those cold eyes, always watching. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped in the suffocating darkness, but eventually the room seemed to shift again, like the space itself was breathing, and I found myself back outside, the door closing behind me with a soft click. But I knew something had changed. I was no longer the same. The keys in my pocket seemed heavier now, and I knew no matter how far I tried to run, the doors would keep calling me. Each one more dangerous than the last. And now, I was already wondering, what would I find next? The days that followed were strange, distorted in ways that made me question my own perception. I couldn't stop thinking about the door I had opened, the room I had found, and the cold whisper that lingered in my ears even after I left. The photographs still haunted me, their unsettling images never far from my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a mistake, one that would cost me more than I could imagine. I tried to go back to normal life, to forget what had happened, but the pull of the keys never loosened. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that room, those eyes following me, waiting. It was as though the room itself had become a part of me, an inescapable part of my soul. I tried to ignore it, but it grew harder each day. I began to feel an overwhelming need to know more, to understand what I had stepped into. I couldn't let it go. It wasn't long before I found myself walking down the same street again, the same narrow alley where the strange door had stood. My hand was already in my pocket, fingers curling around the cold metal of the keys, as though they had a life of their own, drawing me back. The street seemed even more unfamiliar now, as though it had shifted in my absence. The buildings looked slightly off, the shadows longer, the air heavier. I hesitated for a moment, standing at the foot of the alley, but something inside me urged me forward. There was a different key in my hand this time, one that felt more fitting. My fingers brushed against it, and as if by instinct, I turned the corner. At first, I thought I had made a mistake. The alley was empty, silent. No door. Just an ordinary wall. But when I looked closer, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. There was a faint outline of a door, almost invisible, hidden in the shadows. It wasn't a door I recognized from before, but it was a door nonetheless. My heart raced as I approached it, the key already in my hand, the cold weight of it pressing against my palm. I inserted the key into the lock. It clicked, just like the last one. The door opened with a groan, and I stepped inside. This time, the room was different. It wasn't dark or empty like before, but full of light. A soft, warm glow illuminated the space, and I found myself in what looked like an old study. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with ancient-looking books that smelled of dust and age. A large desk sat in the middle of the room, papers scattered across it. But there was something about the room that didn't sit right. It wasn't the books, or the desk, or the papers. It was the feeling that the room was too alive, too aware. I stepped closer to the desk, my eyes drawn to the scattered papers. There were strange symbols and drawings on them, things I couldn't make sense of. But at the center of the desk, there was something that made my blood run cold, a photograph. I recognized the place in the photograph. It was the street where I had found the door, the alley that had led me here. But in the photograph, the street was empty, and in the distance, a shadowy figure stood at the far end, its features obscured by darkness. A figure I somehow recognized, though I couldn't quite place it. The more I stared at the photograph, the more I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Something was wrong. Something was waiting for me, just out of sight. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't tear myself away from the image, as though it had a hold on me, binding me to that moment. And then I heard it. A soft noise, like the rustling of fabric, coming from the corner of the room. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one there. The room was still and silent, except for the faintest whisper of movement. I took a step back, my eyes scanning the room, my pulse quickening. The door had vanished. Panic surged through me. I turned in every direction, desperate to find an exit, but the room seemed to stretch on forever. The shadows in the corners seemed to grow longer, darker, and the air grew thicker with every passing second. I rushed to the walls, pounding on them, trying to find a way out. But the walls were cold, unyielding. There was no escape. Then, from the shadows, the figure in the photograph began to move. I froze. It was slow at first, like a creeping presence, but as it emerged from the darkness, I could see it clearly. A tall, gaunt figure, its face obscured by shadows, but its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It moved toward me with deliberate slowness, each step echoing through the room. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure was almost upon me now, its cold, hollow gaze locking onto mine. "You shouldn't have opened the door," a voice whispered from the shadows, its tone low and menacing. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. The figure reached out, its hand stretching toward me. And then, just as it touched me, everything went dark. I woke up on the street again, the alley before me empty and silent. The key was still in my hand, but the door was gone. I stumbled back, disoriented, my mind reeling from what had just happened, or what I thought had happened. Had it all been a dream? Had I imagined it? The photo, the figure, were they just figments of my imagination? But deep down, I knew the truth. I had opened something, and it wasn't finished with me yet. I couldn't stop myself from turning, walking toward the next door that would call to me. Each key was pulling me forward, and no matter how much I wanted to resist, I knew that I was already too far gone. The mystery had consumed me, and there was no turning back. The next door awaited, and I had to find out what was behind it. The air felt heavier as I walked, the weight of it pressing down on me. I couldn't tell if it was the lingering sense of dread from the room or something else that made the atmosphere so thick, but I felt as though the very air around me was alive. It hummed with an unsettling energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I knew I had to find the next door, but something deep inside me told me to stop, to run, to forget all about this madness. But I couldn't. I was trapped. The key in my pocket seemed to grow warmer with every step I took, almost as if it were alive, pulling me toward its inevitable destination. The streets around me were eerily quiet, not a soul in sight, and yet the shadows stretched unnaturally long, dark corners where I could have sworn something moved just beyond my field of vision. Each step felt like it was taking me deeper into the unknown, into a space where time itself seemed to lose its grip. I turned a corner, and the street changed. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the lighting, the way the buildings seemed slightly off, but as I walked, I began to realize that I wasn't in my neighborhood anymore. The familiar sights I knew were gone. Instead, a strange, almost sterile environment replaced them, sterile buildings with no signs, no life. The windows were dark, the doors closed, and the ground beneath my feet felt unnervingly smooth, almost as though it had been polished, as if waiting for me. Then I saw it. A door. Just standing there, alone in the middle of the street. It was old, wooden, with an intricate design carved into the frame. It didn't belong here. It didn't belong anywhere. I knew, without a doubt, that this was the door I had been searching for. My fingers were already on the key, my breath shallow. I wasn't sure what I expected to find behind the door, but I was certain that the answers I was seeking lay beyond it. My hand trembled as I inserted the key into the lock, and for a moment, the world around me seemed to pause. The distant hum of the city faded away, replaced by an eerie silence. The key turned, and the door creaked open, revealing a room bathed in an unnatural light. I stepped through without thinking. The room was small and square, its walls lined with dusty shelves filled with strange, old books. The air inside was thick and stale, as though no one had been here for years. But that wasn't what unsettled me. What unsettled me was the painting on the far wall. A large, dark portrait of a man, his face obscured by shadows, standing in front of a door not unlike the one I had just opened. His eyes glowed in the dim light, and they seemed to follow me wherever I moved. I could feel the room pressing in on me, the very walls closing in, and the temperature dropped. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself, my breath coming in short bursts. Something wasn't right here, something beyond just the atmosphere. The painting, its eyes, there was something off about it, something that made my stomach churn. I wanted to leave. I turned back toward the door, but the moment I did, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. They were slow, deliberate, like someone was walking just out of my line of sight. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there. The room was as empty as before. The footsteps stopped, but the sound lingered. I felt my pulse quicken, the walls seeming to move closer as if the room itself was alive, closing in around me. The footsteps continued, each one louder than the last, coming closer. I searched the room frantically, but there was nothing. The shelves, the floor, the walls, everything was just still. And then the painting shifted. I gasped, taking a step back as the figure in the portrait seemed to stir. The man's eyes, once glowing with an otherworldly light, now looked more alive. They tracked my movements, followed me as I moved across the room. He was no longer a mere painting. He was watching me. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. The footsteps had stopped, but I could feel the presence behind me, just beyond my shoulder. I didn't dare turn around, afraid of what I might see, what might be standing there, inches from me. The man in the painting raised his hand, pointing directly at me. "You shouldn't have come," the voice echoed in my mind, the words a whisper that sent chills down my spine. I stumbled backward, my hands reaching out for the door, but it was already too late. The door had vanished. The room, no, this place, was no longer the same. The walls twisted, the shelves seemed to warp and stretch, and the figure in the painting was no longer confined to the frame. He stepped forward, his dark figure emerging from the canvas, and for the first time, I saw his face. It was my face. The man grinned, a cold, knowing smile that sent a wave of terror coursing through me. "You can't escape," he whispered, his voice now coming from the air around me. It was all around me, suffocating, pulling me deeper into the nightmare. I ran. I didn't care where. I just had to get out. But the walls seemed to close in on me, the air growing denser with every step. The room shifted and twisted, the door no longer in sight. I turned every corner, trying to find a way out, but the landscape kept changing. The same walls, the same shelves, the same painting, always in the corner of my eye. And then, I stopped. The man's voice whispered one last time, almost lovingly. "You're just like me now." Trapped. The world went black. When I opened my eyes again, I was back on the street, the key still clenched tightly in my hand. The door was gone, but I could feel it. The pull. The next door awaited, and I had no choice but to follow. The feeling of unease still clung to me, thick and suffocating, as though I were walking through a haze. I tried to shake it off, but the pull of the keys was inescapable, and as I stood there on the sidewalk, I could almost hear the whispers of the doors calling to me, beckoning me to continue. I wasn't sure what had happened back in the room. I didn't know if I had truly seen the figure emerge from the painting or if it had all been a hallucination, a product of my mind unraveling. But the sensation of his presence, the touch of his cold smile, it was too real to ignore. I had to keep moving. I had no choice. The world around me seemed to shift once more, like a ripple in a stagnant pool. I could feel it in the air, the way the ground beneath me seemed to vibrate faintly. The streets were quiet, too quiet. No cars, no people. Just the sound of my own breath and the steady thrum of the city in the distance. I reached into my pocket, fingers brushing against the cold metal of the keyring. The next key was larger, more ornate than the others. Its surface gleamed in the dim light, as though it had been polished recently, and it seemed to hum with a quiet energy that sent a chill down my spine. I looked around, but there was no sign of the strange door that had appeared before. The city had changed again. The buildings now had an unfamiliar look, tall, towering structures with narrow windows and sharp angles, as if they had been drawn in haste by an artist who didn't quite know what he was creating. The streets twisted in unnatural ways, creating dead ends where there should have been none. I walked aimlessly, but with purpose, as though the key itself was guiding me. Each step I took felt both deliberate and out of control, as though I was walking on a path that had already been decided for me. And then I saw it. A door. It stood at the end of a narrow alleyway, its dark wood withered and ancient, as if it had been standing there for centuries. The intricate carvings on its surface seemed to shift when I looked at them, flickering like shadows under a weak light. I could feel the heat of the key in my pocket growing warmer as I neared it, as though the metal was alive. I approached slowly, the key now burning against my skin. The door was tall, imposing, and seemed to be waiting for me. My heart raced as I slid the key into the lock, the metal turning with an audible click. The door creaked open, and a rush of cold air swept past me, as though the room beyond had been waiting to exhale. I stepped through. The world on the other side was wrong. The room was vast, far larger than it should have been, stretching endlessly in all directions. The walls were lined with doors, each one identical in appearance, but there was something deeply unsettling about the way they stood, as though they were watching me. The doors weren't real. They couldn't be. They didn't belong to any kind of space I recognized. I stepped further into the room, feeling the weight of the atmosphere pressing in from all sides. The floor beneath me was smooth, the kind of smoothness you would expect from stone that had been polished for centuries. It had a cold, almost unnatural sheen to it, reflecting the dim, flickering light above. But there was no light source. The room was dimly lit by something else, a strange glow that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The glow seemed to pulsate, breathing, alive. A voice echoed through the room, soft and far away, but somehow I knew it was directed at me. It spoke with a soothing, almost melodic tone, but the words made my stomach turn. "You are not the first," it said. I froze. "But you will be the last." My heart skipped a beat, and I spun around, my eyes darting to every door. There was no sign of movement, no clue as to where the voice had come from. But the words, the voice, they were clear. They were real. "Do you understand?" it asked, the tone rising ever so slightly. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I didn't even know what I was supposed to understand. The voice continued, low and menacing. "These doors, they are all yours now. The keys are yours to use. But remember, every choice leads to a new door. And once you open one, you can never close it again." I took a step back, my eyes flicking from one door to the next, each one seeming to loom larger, darker, more ominous. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered. I took another step backward. The temperature in the room dropped, the air turning to ice. My breath came out in invisible puffs, and I could feel the hairs on my arms stand up. The walls began to pulse, as though they were alive, as though the room itself was breathing. I stumbled forward, the keyring still in my hand, but the room began to distort. The edges of the walls seemed to warp, and the doors, which had once been so symmetrical, now looked crooked, bent, as though they were reaching out to me, trying to pull me into their depths. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what to do. But I knew one thing. The voice was right. I couldn't escape. I didn't know how I had ended up here, or what was waiting for me behind these doors, but I was trapped. Each key, each door, was pulling me deeper into this nightmare, and there was no way out. I stood there, frozen in place, my heart racing in my chest. The air in the room grew colder with every passing second, and the oppressive weight of the unseen eyes pressing down on me felt suffocating. The walls, once rigid and unmoving, now shifted imperceptibly, their movements barely noticeable, but there. I could almost hear the faint scratching of something against the stone, the sound of something trying to emerge. My hand, still clutching the keyring, trembled. The keys jangled softly, as though responding to the growing tension in the room. I could feel them pulsing, vibrating with an energy I couldn't understand. Each one of them held a promise, a mystery. Each one led to another door, another path I had no choice but to follow. But my mind raced, scrambling for an explanation. What was this place? What were these doors, these keys? And why was I here? The voice echoed again, soft and haunting. "You are closer now," it whispered. "Closer to understanding, closer to the truth." I felt my skin crawl. The truth? What truth? I glanced around the room, eyes darting from door to door. Some were slightly ajar, their dark openings revealing nothing but shadows. Others remained firmly shut, as if daring me to approach them. But none of them seemed like a way out. They all felt like traps, each one a promise of something darker. The keyring in my hand grew heavier, as though it had been charged with the weight of 1,000 decisions, each one more final than the last. The voice continued, now more insistent, its tone shifting to something deeper, more resonant. "You have been chosen," it said. "And once you've walked through these doors, there is no returning." I couldn't breathe. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing tighter, as though the very air was being sucked out. I could feel my pulse in my ears, deafening in the silence. There was no turning back now. With a sudden, frantic motion, I reached for the nearest door. My fingers brushed against its surface, the cool wood smooth beneath my touch, but the moment I made contact, something inside me recoiled. A deep, guttural feeling churned in my stomach. I couldn't open it. Not yet. I turned to the next door, and the next, each one feeling more and more wrong. The faces seemed to blur in the corners of my vision, distorting into something unfamiliar, something I couldn't place. It was as though the room itself had come alive, each door now holding its own secret, each one waiting to consume me. Suddenly, I felt it. The shift. The room wasn't just moving around me, it was changing. The doors had begun to warp, their edges bending and curling like tendrils, reaching for me, pulling me toward them. A faint whisper rose from behind one of the doors. It was a soft, almost soothing sound, like a lullaby, but it was not meant for comfort. I stepped back, my breathing quick and shallow, and that's when I saw it, the last door, the one at the farthest corner of the room. Unlike the others, it didn't seem to move. It stood still, its surface cracked and weathered, as if it had been waiting for me. And it called to me, quietly, irresistibly. I knew, without a doubt, that it was the door I needed to open. I staggered toward it, my feet unsteady, my head swimming with the weight of what was to come. The key in my hand seemed to vibrate faster, as if it knew what I was about to do. As I neared, the door's surface shimmered, the cracks pulsating with a strange light, as though something was waiting on the other side. I took a deep breath, my fingers trembling as I slid the key into the lock. The moment the key turned, the door creaked open, and a cold wind rushed past me, carrying with it the scent of decay. The air was thick with the weight of something ancient, something buried for far too long. Behind the door, there was nothing. A vast, empty void stretched out in front of me, an endless darkness that seemed to go on forever. But in the distance, I could see a faint glimmer, a tiny, flickering light, like a distant star in the void. It beckoned me forward. I stepped through, my heart pounding as I walked into the abyss. The door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing in the silence. For a moment, I was suspended in nothingness, my feet floating above the ground. The light flickered again, this time closer. I felt a pull, a force drawing me in. And then I saw it, something moving within the darkness, a shape, a figure, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. It was coming toward me, but it didn't move like any creature I had ever seen. It slithered, like it was being pulled from the very air. I couldn't breathe. The figure reached out to me, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, its smile wide and hungry. "Welcome," it whispered. And that was the last thing I heard before everything went black. The keys were gone. The doors were closed. And I was left to wonder if I had ever truly left the room at all. Have you ever met someone in your dreams who you've never seen before, only to find them standing in front of you in real life? I know it sounds crazy, but it's happening to me. And I'm terrified it's not just a coincidence. It all started about a month ago. I had the strangest dream. There was a man, someone I didn't recognize, yet his face felt so familiar, like I should know him. His eyes were dark, almost hollow, and his expression was unreadable. He stood just out of reach, never speaking, but I could feel his presence in every inch of the dream. It wasn't a pleasant feeling. It was as if he was waiting for something. Or maybe for me. I woke up that night feeling unsettled, but I brushed it off, thinking it was just a strange dream. The next night, the same man appeared. Again, his eyes locked onto mine, that same oppressive feeling hanging in the air. And again, when I woke up, I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then it happened again. And again. Each time, the dreams became more vivid, more real. I began to notice things I hadn't before. The man in the dream wore the same clothes, an old black coat and a gray scarf. His hair was dark, almost black, and unkempt. The more I saw him, the more I began to recognize little details, the way he looked at me, the small scar on his cheek, the way his lips twitched when I tried to speak to him but couldn't. I started feeling like he was watching me, not just in my sleep, but in the real world. At first, I thought it was just a strange coincidence, but it didn't stop there. One evening, I was walking home from work when I saw him. I froze. He was standing across the street, just staring at me, as if he had been waiting for me. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to convince myself it was just another person who happened to look like him. But the more I looked, the more I was sure it was him, the same man from my dreams. The same cold, empty eyes. The same scar on his cheek. I quickly turned down an alley, my breath quickening. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel his eyes on me. Watching. Waiting. The next day, I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was imagining things. But the dreams kept coming, and every day, I would catch glimpses of him. I saw him in the corner of my eye, always just out of reach, always somewhere I wasn't expecting him to be. At work, I was beginning to feel paranoid. I couldn't focus on anything. Every shadow seemed like him, every creak in the building felt like his footsteps, always too close. Even when I was in my apartment, the feeling of being watched never went away. I started to lock all the doors and windows at night, even though I knew it was ridiculous. Then, one afternoon, as I sat in a cafe, nursing a coffee, I glanced up from my cup and saw him again. This time, he was sitting at the table across from mine. His gaze met mine instantly, and my breath caught in my throat. My pulse raced, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. He was sitting just a few feet away, but there was something wrong with the way he looked at me, like he was seeing right through me. I didn't know what to do. Should I leave? Should I confront him? But my body wouldn't let me move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from his. It was as if I was locked in place, drawn to him by some invisible force. Then, without a word, he stood up and walked out of the cafe. My mind was spinning. How did he get there? How did he know I would be there? The answer felt just out of reach, and I could almost hear the sound of his footsteps echoing in my head. As I stood up to leave, my hands were shaking. My mind raced with questions. Was this real? Or was I losing my mind? The man from my dreams wasn't just a figment of my imagination anymore. He was here, in my life, in my world, and I had no idea what he wanted from me. But I had a feeling that the longer I waited to find out, the worse it would get. I couldn't run away from him. Not anymore. The next few days felt like I was trapped in some twisted version of reality. I couldn't shake the feeling that the lines between my dreams and my waking life were beginning to blur. I would wake up in the morning feeling his presence linger, as if he had been in my room while I slept. There were times I thought I saw him in my peripheral vision, only for him to disappear the moment I turned my head. I tried to carry on with my daily routine, going to work, meeting friends, walking the familiar streets, but nothing felt normal anymore. The man from my dreams was always there, lurking just out of sight. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. One night, as I was walking home from a late shift, the air felt unusually heavy. The streetlights cast long shadows, stretching across the pavement like fingers reaching toward me. I quickened my pace, my footsteps echoing in the empty street. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. And then I heard it. A sound, soft at first, like the shuffle of feet on concrete. I froze, my heart pounding. I didn't dare look behind me, but I knew he was there. Just like in my dreams, that familiar presence filled the air. I could almost feel his gaze on me, cold and unblinking. I broke into a run, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I sprinted down the street. The sound of footsteps behind me grew louder, matching my pace, never falling behind, never getting closer. It was like I was being chased by a shadow, a phantom that could never be outrun. When I reached my apartment building, I slammed the door behind me, my hands trembling as I locked it. I pressed my back against the door, trying to calm my racing heart. But even as I stood there, panting, I could feel him. He was close, so close. I knew then that this wasn't just a dream. He wasn't just in my head. He was real. And he was hunting me. The next day, I decided to take a different route to work, hoping to break free from the pattern I had fallen into. But no matter which direction I went, no matter how I tried to avoid him, I could feel him. Every corner I turned, every shadow I passed, he was there, just out of reach, watching me. By now, I was losing sleep, losing my grip on reality. I couldn't tell if I was still dreaming or if I was awake. I began to question everything. Was I going crazy? Or was something truly following me? The fear gnawed at me, slowly tearing away at my sanity. And then came the worst part. One evening, as I lay in bed, exhausted from another sleepless night, I heard it. A knock. Soft, gentle, but unmistakable. It came from somewhere deep in the apartment, right behind me. My blood ran cold. I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't. But my body betrayed me, slowly shifting until I was facing the bedroom door. The knock came again, louder this time. And then, without warning, the door creaked open. I could see nothing at first, just the dark hallway stretching out beyond the doorframe. But then, a figure emerged from the shadows. His face was pale, expressionless, but his eyes, they were the same as in my dreams. Dark, hollow, and full of something I couldn't comprehend. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. My legs were frozen, as if rooted to the spot. He stepped closer. Every movement was deliberate, slow. My breath caught in my throat as he approached. I wanted to ask him who he was, what he wanted, but no words came. Finally, he stopped in front of me. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes said everything. He was here. He had found me. And whatever this was, this nightmare that had spilled into my waking life, it was far from over. I couldn't look away. My mind screamed for me to run, to escape, but my body didn't obey. It was as if I was caught in some terrible trance. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. The room was empty. The door was closed. I sat there for a long time, my heart racing, my mind a blur of terror. Was I dreaming? Was I awake? I couldn't tell anymore. I knew one thing, though, he would be back. And next time, I might not be able to escape. The days after that night were a blur. I tried to tell myself it was just a bad dream, that the man wasn't real. But the feeling of his presence, his cold, unwavering gaze, lingered long after the encounter. My sleep became fitful, broken by flashes of his face in my mind, and I started to fear falling asleep. Because when I did, he was there, waiting in the dark corners of my dreams. I couldn't trust my own senses anymore. The line between reality and dream was dissolving, and with each passing moment, it became harder to separate the two. I went to work, but everything felt unreal, like I was watching my life through a foggy window, disconnected from the world around me. People spoke to me, but their voices seemed muffled, distant. My own reflection in mirrors seemed like a stranger, and I would catch myself staring into the glass, searching for any sign of the man, but there was nothing. I tried to talk to my friends about it, but they dismissed it as stress. "You're just overworking yourself," one of them said, giving me a sympathetic pat on the back. "You need to relax. Take a break." But how could I explain that it wasn't just stress? It wasn't something that could be solved with a few days off or a cup of coffee. The man wasn't just in my dreams anymore. He was a part of my waking life. I could see him out of the corner of my eye, always there, just beyond my reach. A shadow, a presence, never fully seen but always felt. And I was starting to realize I wasn't sure if I could trust my own mind anymore. One evening, after a long day, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The city was quiet, the streets empty, save for the occasional passing car. I wandered aimlessly, lost in thought, until I found myself at the edge of a park. The trees loomed tall against the dusky sky, their branches swaying in the evening breeze. I stood there for a moment, listening to the wind rustle the leaves, and then I heard it. A sound. Soft at first, but unmistakable. Footsteps. My heart stopped. I turned, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was no one. The path was empty, the park eerily silent. Yet, the footsteps continued, growing closer, like someone was walking just out of sight, deliberately staying out of view. My breath quickened as I stood frozen in place, waiting for the inevitable. And then, from the shadows of the trees, he emerged. The man. The stranger. He didn't speak. He never spoke. He just stood there, his dark eyes fixed on me, as though he had been waiting for me. His face was blank, his features smooth and expressionless, but the intensity of his gaze was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I wanted to run. My legs screamed for me to turn and flee, but I couldn't. My body refused to obey. I was paralyzed by fear, unable to move, unable to scream. I felt trapped, like I was caught in a nightmare that refused to end. He stepped forward, one slow, deliberate movement at a time. Each step echoed in the stillness, the sound impossibly loud. I tried to back away, but my feet felt heavy, like they were sinking into the ground. Then, he stopped in front of me. He was so close now that I could feel the coldness radiating from his body. He leaned in, his breath brushing against my ear, though he never made a sound. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and yet, the world around us seemed to fade into silence. There was nothing but the man, standing so still, so unblinking, that I almost forgot how to breathe. And then, without warning, he reached out. His hand moved slowly, deliberately, as if to touch me. I felt the air shift around him, colder, sharper. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my mind racing, desperate to understand what was happening. But nothing made sense. All I could do was stand there, feeling the chill of his presence creeping into my bones. And just as his fingers brushed against my skin, the world around us flickered. The shadows seemed to twist, the ground beneath me shifted, and in an instant, everything changed. The man was gone. The park was empty again. The footsteps had stopped. The silence was deafening. I stood there for what felt like hours, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it real? Was it another dream? But as I stood there in the cold, dark park, I realized something that made my stomach churn. I wasn't sure anymore. Was he real? Or was I losing my mind? Either way, I knew one thing for certain: he was getting closer. The days that followed felt like a constant state of limbo, my mind caught between reality and something darker. I went through the motions, work, eating, sleeping, but it all felt distant, disconnected. Even my own reflection seemed like a memory, something I could no longer touch. The man was still there, in the back of my mind, in the corners of my vision. Sometimes, I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the feeling that he was standing at the foot of my bed, watching me. It didn't help that the people around me had started to notice. I could see their worried glances, the way they looked at me like I was hiding something, like I had become different. My friends no longer laughed at my jokes. They asked questions I didn't know how to answer. "Are you okay?" they'd say, their voices laced with concern. "You don't seem like yourself." I wanted to tell them the truth. I wanted to scream at them, to make them see what was happening, but I couldn't. It was like I was slipping away, becoming less and less real. The man had a way of taking over everything. I started to avoid sleep, staying up late with books, with work, with distractions. But no matter what I did, the man's face was there, waiting for me in the silence. I would close my eyes, and he would be waiting, standing in the shadows of my dreams, his eyes cold and unblinking. One night, when I could no longer keep my eyes open, I finally collapsed into bed, hoping for rest, for peace, even though I knew it wouldn't come. I woke up in the dark, but this time something was different. It wasn't just the usual chill of the room. The air felt thick, suffocating. The shadows seemed deeper, more oppressive. I looked around, panic starting to rise in my chest. The room was familiar, but the atmosphere felt wrong. It felt like a dream, distorted and hazy, but I knew it wasn't. The man was in the room. I could feel him. I turned to the door, hoping to run, but the door was gone. There was only a wall where it had been. My breath caught in my throat. I was trapped. I turned back around, and there he was, standing in the corner, as he always did, just watching. He didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel the weight of his presence pressing in on me. Why? I whispered, my voice shaking. Why are you doing this? There was no answer, only the steady gaze of his dark eyes, the weight of his silence. But as I looked closer, something shifted. A faint flicker in the air around him. A distortion, like a ripple in the fabric of reality itself. And then, just like that, I knew. I wasn't in my room anymore. I wasn't even in my apartment. I was somewhere else, somewhere twisted, somewhere that didn't follow the rules of the world I knew. The walls warped, the ceiling twisted, and the floor cracked open beneath me. The man remained standing, his eyes never leaving mine as the room around us morphed into something unrecognizable. I stumbled backward, my mind racing, but the room kept shifting, growing darker, the shadows creeping closer. I couldn't escape. No matter which way I turned, I couldn't find a way out. I was suffocating, drowning in this nightmare that felt all too real. The man took a step forward, slowly, deliberately. Each step echoed in the darkness, louder than the last. I felt my heart hammering in my chest, and I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. He was too close now. So close I could feel the coldness radiating from him, like ice, like death. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, he raised his hand. His fingers brushed against my cheek, cold and sharp, and I felt a jolt of something, fear, pain, or something else entirely, shoot through me. I gasped, recoiling from his touch, but it was too late. My vision blurred, the world around me spinning, and for a moment, I thought I might lose myself entirely. But then, everything stopped. The darkness faded. The twisted room returned to normal. The man was gone. I was back in my bed. In my apartment. I sat up, gasping for air, my heart still racing in my chest. I touched my cheek, where his fingers had been, and it was ice cold to the touch. I wasn't sure what had just happened. Was it a dream? A vision? Or something else? But as I sat there, trying to calm my breath, I realized something that made my blood run cold. I had no idea if I was still dreaming, or if I had just crossed over into something worse. Because the man wasn't gone. He was still with me. I couldn't sleep anymore. Not after that night. Not after everything that had happened. The man in my dreams, no, in my life, had somehow crossed a boundary. I wasn't sure if it was me who had crossed over, or if it was him. Either way, something was wrong, something that couldn't be explained by simple logic. He was here, in my reality, in ways that made no sense. The next day, I went to work, but it felt like I was walking through a fog. The faces of my coworkers blurred as I moved past them, their voices distant and muffled, like I wasn't really there. I tried to focus, to convince myself that everything was fine, that the nightmare was just that, a nightmare. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, always just behind me. Every corner I turned, I half expected to see him standing there, watching me. His cold, empty gaze had seared into my memory, and I couldn't forget it. It was always lurking, always waiting. I tried to talk to people, tried to make sense of what was happening, but the words got caught in my throat. How could I explain this? How could I tell anyone that a man I had never met in real life was haunting my every step, blurring the lines between dreams and waking life? I found myself standing outside the cafe again, the one where I had found the keys, hoping that somehow, someway, I would find the answer. The keys felt like a distant memory now, a faint connection to the strange events that had set this all in motion. But as I stepped inside, a cold chill washed over me. The barista at the counter greeted me with a polite smile, but I could see something different in her eyes. Recognition, maybe. Like she had been expecting me. I ignored the strange feeling and sat at the corner table, my eyes scanning the room, searching for any sign of the man. And then, just like before, it happened. My heart skipped a beat as I saw him standing across the room, by the window, his back to me. His posture was familiar, too familiar, and I felt the cold grip of fear tighten around me. I didn't know how, but I knew he was aware of me. He knew I was looking at him. The room seemed to darken around me, the edges of my vision blurring. The hum of the cafe faded into an eerie silence, and all I could hear was the sound of my breath, shallow and panicked. I tried to stand, to move, but my legs felt heavy, as though they were made of stone. The man turned slowly, his eyes locking onto mine. His gaze pierced through me like ice, and for a moment, I was frozen. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, he spoke. "You don't belong here." His words echoed in my mind, reverberating through my skull, as if they were being whispered directly into my consciousness. I felt a sharp pain behind my eyes, a pressure building in my head. My body trembled, but I couldn't break free from his gaze. "I've been waiting for you," he continued, his voice low and cold. "This is where it begins, and where it ends." The words hung in the air like a threat, and I finally managed to tear my eyes away from his. My mind raced, the weight of his words sinking in. What did he mean? Waiting for me? Where it begins and ends? I couldn't understand, but I had no time to think. In an instant, the cafe seemed to disappear. The floor beneath me vanished, and I was falling, tumbling through an endless void. I reached out, trying to grab onto something, anything, but there was nothing to hold. The world around me was a blur of color, of twisted shapes, and distorted sounds. I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the void. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. I was back in my apartment, lying on the floor. My body ached, and my head throbbed with a dull pain. The air around me was thick, suffocating, and the room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. I sat up slowly, my heart racing in my chest. My hands shook as I touched my face, expecting to feel something, some sign that I had been somewhere else. But there was nothing. I was back, but nothing felt real. The man wasn't there, but his presence lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. I stood, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. What had just happened? Where had I gone? What was real? And then, just as I was about to collapse from the weight of it all, I saw it. The door. The door that had never been there before. It stood at the far side of the room, just beyond my reach, as if it had materialized from nowhere. The handle gleamed in the dim light, cold and inviting. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my mind screaming at me to run, to stay away. But I couldn't. I didn't know why, but I walked toward it, my hand reaching for the handle. As I touched it, a voice whispered in my ear, a familiar voice, one that made my blood run cold. "It's time." I turned the handle and stepped through the door. And everything went dark. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.